Gangland, The Secret Wars of the FBI's Gambino Squad, The Hunt for John Gotti, by Howard Bloom, read by Jerry Orbach.
This book could not have been written without the unprecedented help I received from the FBI. I was granted official access to everyone who played a role in building the Bureau's case against John Gotti. I interviewed officials in Washington and New York, members of the Special Projects Group in Quantico, Virginia, and agents from the C-16 squad who did the actual street work which culminated in Gotti's indictment and conviction. I met with members of the team who broke into the Ravenite Social Club in the middle of the night and planted the bugs. I spoke to the agents involved in turning Sammy the Bull Gravano, as well as the men who debriefed him and even boxed with him. I interviewed at length the men who, over a number of years, hunted for Gotti's spy and law enforcement. I also met with state and federal prosecutors, New York City police officials, and defense attorneys, and I reviewed thousands of pages of trial and audio surveillance transcripts, as well as volumes of previously confidential police and FBI reports filed during the Gotti investigation. Further, this book could not have been written without the cooperation of a few members of the Gambino crime family, who, for whatever reason, also allowed themselves to be interviewed. Their story, too, is told in these pages. Part 1. The Mole File. From the apartment window 5 floors above Soho Billiards, Scott Behar had a perfect sightline. He sat on a steel folding chair that was cushioned with a blue and orange Let's Go Mets pillow. The chair had been placed right next to the window, and when he parted the white vertical blinds just a crack, he could look straight down Mulberry Street. Staring through binoculars, he focused on the steel door of a red brick-faced tenement that was nearly 3 blocks away. For the past 9 months, Behar had been part of the FBI team assigned to keep track of who entered the 2 narrow, dark rooms on the ground floor of 247 Mulberry Street. It was the Ravenite Social Club, and despite its run-down appearance, it was the headquarters of the richest and most powerful mafia clan in America, the Gambino family. Just before 5, they started arriving. They came in Cadillacs and Lincolns mostly. The big cars were soon double-parked along both sides of Mulberry Street. It would be, he realized, a busy evening. 5 new members were being inducted into the family tonight. They would become partners in an organization that ran businesses throughout the city worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a diversified portfolio that included trucking, cement, construction, garbage collection, manufacturing, pornography, loan sharking, and narcotics. Each of the 5 made men would be set for life, and all they had to do in return was obey without hesitation every order, no matter what it required, that was passed on from the head of the family, John Gotti. Like Scott Behar, John Gotti was also focusing his attentions that afternoon, but on an object more closely at hand. The boss of the Gambino crime family was sitting in a wood-paneled courtroom about a mile downtown from the observation post, and he was very intently reading a frayed paperback edition of Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. In fact, so total was Gotti's absorption in the German philosopher's words that he read on, seemingly oblivious to the trial that was proceeding around him, or to the possibility that, if he were convicted of the state assault charge, he would be sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison. Gotti, always quick with a sound bite, had taunted the crowd of reporters who had flocked to the trial's opening day. "I'll give you 3 to 1 I beat this rap." The state was offering persuasive evidence to prove that Gotti had ordered the shooting of a troublesome union official. There was even a tape recording of Gotti, wild with indignant rage, ordering the attack. "Bust him up! Put a rocket in his pocket!" This day, America's most notorious gangster sat in the courtroom reading Nietzsche. He also, a clue to his steady mood, guarded a large and very valuable secret. He had an edge. The verdict was as good as guaranteed. When the trial adjourned for the day, things began to pick up at the Ravenite. Behar's camera had already caught Joe Butch Correo, lean and elegant, a silver-haired mafia prince, entering the club. Walking behind him, but rushing forward awkwardly at the last moment to grab the front door, was a bear of a man, George Helbig. Even through the camera lens he looked big and fat and mean. After only 6 minutes inside the club, the two men left. Helbig again held the door, but Salvatore Gravano, the Gambino family's underboss, now led the way. He was 5'6" in his high-heeled boots, but he had been shooting $3,000 a week of decadurabolin steroids into his body for so long that he had beefed up to 175 pounds and had forearms nearly the size of beer kegs. That was one reason why people on the street called him Sammy Bull. The other was that he killed people. As soon as the three men began to walk up Mulberry, Behar reached for the walkie-talkie and spoke over the encrypted frequency. "This is Coop. Number 3 is out and walking north toward Prince Street with 2 friends." The message was received by a female agent sitting in a tan Pontiac parked further downtown on Lafayette Street. It was the middle of a New York winter. She had never expected any of the boys to go for a walk-talk outside the club, unless she realized it was very important. "Roger." She started the car's engine. Deep Street, as the Bureau's Special Projects Group had christened their creation last fall, was ready to go operational for the first time. At just about that moment, across the East River, in a boxy office building along a stretch of Queens Boulevard, the red phone rang at the desk of Bruce Mao, the head of the FBI's Gambino squad, the C-16 team. It was the observation post above the billiard parlor calling to report that the curbside listening device would soon be activated. The news filled Mao with some anticipation. If the technical crew had managed to devise a strategy for eavesdropping on the Gambino family's conversations outside the Ravenite, when the mob least expected any electronic surveillance, the recordings could prove very interesting. After he was told that Gravano was accompanied by the unlikely pair of Joe Butch Correo and George Helbig, whatever calmness he still managed to convey on the phone was all disguise. For the past 3 years, Bruce Mao had lived with one large and controlling ambition: to bring down John Gotti. Gotti's invincibility had become the stuff of legends. The Teflon Don, the tabloids called him. Over the past 3 years, city and federal prosecutors had confidently hauled Gotti into the courtroom. Yet at the conclusion of both cases, there was Gotti and his crew of feisty lawyers, their hands held high in victory like Olympic champions, posing for the television cameras. And today's image, Gotti smirking through his latest trial, a book coolly in hand, was just as indelible and infuriating. Mao was convinced that nobody was that smart, or that lucky. Someone had to be feeding him information that was allowing him to get away, quite literally, with murder. Gotti, Mao had increasingly come to suspect, had a well-placed mole in law enforcement. In the past year, he had started to notice a coincidence that occurred with a tantalizing regularity. Each time a hint of the mole's handiwork surfaced, like magic, the incongruous duo of a capo and a gopher, Correo and Helbig, would appear in tandem at the Ravenite. So when the agent of the observation post asked Mao if he should telephone him at home to report on the results of the curbside device, Mao put on his terse commander's voice and said he would wait at his desk. Gotti's luck couldn't last forever. Or could it? The technical challenge of eavesdropping on the mob's walk-talks, Mao had glumly realized 5 months earlier, was a particularly complicated one. Still, Mao, who had learned a bit about motivation in his 4 years at Annapolis, took a giant step away from his normally soft-spoken reserve and had taunted the techies. "When I was an engineering officer on a nuclear sub, we'd be able to hunker down right under the polar ice cap and send a radio message halfway across the world to command at Norfolk. Now don't tell me you can't figure out a way to get a clandestine transmission out of Little Italy." The head of the New York Tech Unit, Jim Kallstrom, an ex-Marine infantry officer and still very gung-ho, bit immediately at the bait. "We'll find a way." Kallstrom's assistant, John Kravick, the man who actually had to solve the problem, was a more crusty type. The microphone, or maybe even microphones, had to be strong enough to pick up conversations from up and down the block, and they would somehow have to be planted outside on a city street that was always bustling with activity. There were also all the normal technical headaches that came with working in New York. A battery-powered radio transmitter would have to be a particularly strong one, since the city is jammed with hundreds of thousands of signals. You could instead go hard wire, that is, hook the mics up to an existing electrical system, say a street lamp or a telephone pole, and piggyback a free ride on this current. That meant you would have to do all this extensive wiring more or less out in the open, on a busy street. And to complicate matters further, since these were outdoor mics, they had to be sophisticated enough to pick up whispered conversations while screening out honking horns, howling ambulances, and rushing fire engines. And finally, you had to be able to switch the mics on and off in an instant, since it was illegal to monitor anyone walking down Mulberry Street other than the court-sanctioned targets. The solution was ingenious. His plan, in broad strokes, was to outfit a small fleet of cars with a number of miniature directional microphones. Early each morning, assuming the very believable cover of a frazzled New Yorker looking for a valid alternate side-of-the-street parking space, an agent would park as close as he could to 247 Mulberry Street. The empty vehicle, a four-wheeled recording and transmitting studio, would stay in place all day. Who would notice? That night, after the Ravenite had shut down, the car would be driven back to headquarters and the day's tapes retrieved. The car mics would be activated by remote control whenever the observation post spotted the targets taking to the street for a conversation. At 6:30, on the evening of January 17, 1990, Deep Street, once merely a small tactical glimmer in Bruce Mau's operational eye, was about to be thrown into the long-running battle against John Gotti. But what Deep Street recorded was mostly a long, irritating hum. It was a worry spot Kravik had never anticipated. Wise guys don't care where they park their cars. Pulling onto the sidewalk was, after all, a small crime in their scheme of things. On that evening, with so many of the 21 Gambino captains showing up, the narrow street was jammed with vehicles. A haphazard row of parked cars, a small mountain of metal, was wedged on the sidewalk separating the Buick Riviera from the trio of targets. The Quantico outdoor microphones had not been designed to listen through walls of steel. It was just bad luck, Mau was told when the observation post reported in, but this was small consolation to Bruce Mau. John Gotti's mood, meanwhile, was also sinking. The Don, ignorant of the victory luck had just helped him score against the Feds, was caught up in his own despairing evening. George Helbig and Joe Butch Correo were brought before their Don. Gotti looked up at them. "What's up, Brother G? Good news?" The grim reaper, George Helbig, was like an excited schoolboy who couldn't wait to show his teacher what he knew. "I brought you bad news." Shortly after 8, on the bright winter's morning after that busy night of January 17th, the agents of the C-16 team assembled in Mau's office. They were the key players on his squad, the inner circle they called themselves. Leaning against the closed door was George Gabriel. He was long and wry, a handsome Greek with jet-black curly hair and a thick bartender's mustache. His complicated relationship with Mau could skid between protege, younger brother, and junior agent all in the course of one conversation. Sitting opposite Mau was Andy Kearns. He was short and sly and up for anything. He and Mau had been working together since the beginning, a decade now, and they had built a partnership based on friendship, respect, and a lot of late nights. And by the window, blocking out the view of the Alexander's sign in the distance, were the twins. Matty Tricorico and Frank Sparrow didn't look alike. One was tall, the other short. One had hair, the other didn't. But they had worked together as a team for so long, they were so inseparable that they might just as well have been joined at the hip. Mau began without preamble. The Grim Reaper's bad news had been recorded. This time every worry spot had been anticipated. Each word came in loud and clear. He had already advanced the tape to the crucial moment, and now he turned the switch. From the speakers, John Gotti's tired, put-upon voice filled the room. "All right, this Grim Reaper, where is he, this fucking bum?" As the tape continued to play, the agents heard Helbig's news. He had learned that there were 2 ongoing bugs being run by the State Organized Crime Task Force aimed at Sammy Bull Gravano. No one interrupted as the tape played on, but every agent in the room knew the information was correct, and that it was secret, a crucial, closely held secret. It was valuable intelligence betrayed by a highly placed traitor, a report from the mob's mole. When it was over, Kearns was the first to speak. The monster has reared its ugly head again. You were right all along. Johnny Boy's got his mole, all right. Mao removed a manila folder. Across its front was typed, Gotti, leaks from unknown subjects. It was at least 3 inches thick, and most of the papers inside were not the usual Bureau 302s, but notes in Mao's careful and precise handwriting. It was a record of all the clues he had collected over the years that had provoked his suspicions and then, in time, shaped his theory. The inner circle called it the mole file. We never did ID him, but now at least we know for sure what we're up against, that we're not paranoid. Since they did not know whom to trust, since the traitor could be working for the prosecutors or the police or the state or even the Bureau, they would trust no one. If they failed, John Gotti, their smirking adversary for so long, might remain forever beyond their reach. Part 2. Taking It to the Streets. They called themselves the Sunluck Mafia. They were just drinking buddies, a clique of youngish, hard-edged FBI agents who got together after work to unwind at the Sunluck Bar. Night after night in the early 70s, the agents, new to the Bureau and to New York, would trek over from headquarters. Mostly veterans, Vietnam was still very much with them. Jim Kallstrom, for one, had signed up for the Marines straight out of the University of Massachusetts ROTC program and spent a tour on the front lines as a forward observer for the 1st Battalion Gunners. Kallstrom looked back at the group that on those resolute days were shaped by introspective nights at the Sunluck. When we joined the Bureau, a lot of us young Turks still found ourselves chomping to get involved in another war. Only this time we wanted it to be a conflict where things would be clearly defined, good and evil, friend and foe. The war against the mob was our second chance, a war we would fight until it was truly over. Over the next rush of years, the young Turks of the Sunluck Mafia put in their time. As the 1980s dawned, they were at last moving up in the ranks. They were now the bosses, and with those first grasps of power, they went on the attack. It was Jules Bonavolonta, on his way to becoming head of the New York office's Organized Crime and Narcotics Division, who stumbled onto the strategic case from which the Sunluck Mafia's new war against the mob could be launched. It was June 1980. Prosecutors and police officials were attending a seminar on organized crime by Robert Blakey, a Notre Dame law school professor. He insisted that the Bureau's war on the mob was a waste of the taxpayers' money. The FBI, he announced to a room that had become ominously quiet, was going about things entirely the wrong way. He contended there was a more effective strategy. Zap the mob, not mobsters. The FBI's current practice of targeting individuals, of sending out squads to combat specific crimes, was doomed to fail. It could take years to build a case against even, say, a low-level loan shark or gambler. Therefore, it was necessary to attack the entire organization. And best of all, Blakey went on, an instinctive showman building to his dazzling finale, the legal sledgehammer to deliver these mortal blows already existed. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act had been federal law for a decade. RICO, as prosecutors called it, had been used to build successful cases against mob-infiltrated labor unions and businesses. These same criminal enterprise and pattern of racketeering statutes, Blakey explained, could be directed against the membership of an organized crime family. With RICO, the FBI could focus its resources on taking out an entire family. Jules Bonavolonta realized that when Blakey was done, all eyes in the room seemed to focus on him. My eyes just flashed with the beauty of it all. As soon as Blakey finished, I jumped up and said, "You're absolutely right. Now tell us how to do it." A decision was soon made. A new strategy was set in motion. The war against the mob would be led by FBI teams that targeted specific crime families, and RICO would be the weapon of choice. The second point of attack was electronic surveillance. Few in the Bureau saw the potential of that weapon either. In fact, Jim Kallstrom felt that his career in organized crime had come to an abrupt dead end when he was ordered to fill a vacancy on the New York office's technical squad. In those days, the tech squad mostly bugged the phones of Soviet diplomats or hit a mic in the bedroom of an Iron Curtain cultural attaché. But in 1976, to his complete surprise, Kallstrom was made head of the New York tech squad. and now that he was running things, he poured his heart into it. He commissioned some amazing pieces of technology. He convinced dozens of civilian engineers and technicians to trade higher pay for what he buoyantly described as the most exciting job in the world, and it's legal, too. Within a decade, he had created and commanded a powerful empire. The New York Technical Squad had at least 350 men and an annual budget of about $20 million. To Kallstrom's focused way of looking at things, one prospect was most satisfying. I gave them one hell of a stake to drive into the Mafia's heart. But it was Jim Moody, more than anyone else in the Bureau, who understood how to mount the full attack. Squads of organized crime agents would be set up near the neighborhoods where the wise guys lived, in the boroughs and beyond the bright lights of Manhattan where the mob soldiers retreated after a hard day's night of crime. The idea was for us to sort of hunker down and establish beachheads in the midst of enemy territory. Moody, later the chief of the Bureau's organized crime section, saw the battle plan as precise. 1, we would take the attack into the streets. We would identify the enemy and put him in our sights. 2, we would bring it into his home. We would hit him with electronic surveillance where he least expected it. And 3, we would bite off his head. We'd use RICO to wipe out the leaders of each family. All that remained then, back in 1980, was to find someone to spearhead this new drive against the Mafia. The Bureau needed an agent to go into the newly opened office on Queens Boulevard and head its Gambino family squad. They chose a tall, gangly, rather scholarly-looking man. He seemed, by demeanor and experience, to be colossally ill-suited for the task. The only thing was, Bruce Mao was determined to get the job done. For Mao, the summons to head the Gambino squad was 2 strokes of luck in one unanticipated swoop. It was his escape, and better still, his return. 3 years earlier, he had been plucked from organized crime in New York and assigned to headquarters in Washington. The call back to New York to head the Gambino squad was his big opportunity, and he was ready for it. He felt exactly as he had when he left Orange City, Iowa for Annapolis at age 17, certain he was going off to make his mark in the world. 15 men going against 3,000. From the start, Mao hadn't liked the odds. He had done the math a day or so before reporting for the first time to the office on Queens Boulevard, and it had worked out like this. They were giving him the Gambino squad, or in Bureau speak, the C-16 team. He would have, same as any other FBI criminal squad, 15 agents, if, of course, he was lucky enough to get a full roster. The Gambinos included, beginning at the top of the pyramid, the family's administration, an all-powerful boss, the underboss who was second in command, and the consigliere who served as counsel to the head of the family. Then there were the captains. The Gambinos had about 20 of these capos, and each ran his own crew. You had to figure that in each crew, or decinas, as he had also heard them called, there were at least 10 or perhaps 15 soldiers. And these were just the made men, the wise guys who had been formally inducted into family. For every soldier, there were a dozen or more associates hanging out with the crew, and each one of them was eager to do whatever it took to get made. So when Mao had added it all up, on one side of the ledger were his 15 agents, and on the other were the 3,000 or so members of the Gambino family his squad was supposed to put behind bars. But the numbers were the least of his problems. There was the matter of the intelligence files. There weren't any. Before he could mount or even plan an attack, he had to go through the long and tedious process of identifying the enemy. Who were the Gambino family leaders? What businesses were they involved in? Where did they live, hang out? Which were the most active crews? All these background questions had to be answered before he could go on an operational footing. Mao also found whatever hopes he had had were undermined by another discovery, the sorry state of his troops. Personnel had assigned to his command the dregs of the entire Bureau. He would have to recruit his own team. Only where would he find them? As it worked out, they found him. Agent Andy Kearns had been christened Andris in Riga 8 years before he and his parents arrived at a chicken farm in Indiana. Therefore, Latvian was his second tongue, Russian his third, and German almost a fourth. He wasn't happy, but he had to agree it made sense when the Bureau ordered him from its field office in Tampa, Florida, and assigned him to foreign counterintelligence in New York. It stopped making sense, though, when he arrived at 26 Federal Plaza and learned he would be working on the Chinese FCI squad. He decided to ask around about a transfer. Bruce Mao, in his shirt sleeves, a row of pens and pencils lining his breast pocket just above the JBM monogram, sat perched on the long walnut table in the Queen's office conference room. Andy Kearns stood opposite him as if at attention. Kearns just listened, all the time sizing up the guy doing the talking. "We got nothing. We got zero intelligence base. We got no cases worth shit. We don't even have the prospects of any cases. We're starting at the very beginning." Kearns liked what he saw. Mao was very impressive. He had this quiet, almost soft voice, but at the same time he came across very forceful and confident. A no-bullshit guy, Kearns decided instantly. A leader. "It'll be a lot of hard work. Forget 9 to 5. We'll be working around the clock." As Mao spoke, he too, no doubt, was doing his own appraising. To look at Andy Kearns, he appeared harmless enough. A glance through his bureau service record would only indicate he was a man who got results. But despite his dour appearance and deadpan gaze, his methods were generally 1 part invention to 2 parts mischief. Mao's first intimations of Kearns' spirited approach came when Kearns snapped back as soon as Mao had finished his intentionally blunt speech. "Sounds like you could really use a guy like me." Mao puffed on his pipe and thought about that. "I'll put in the papers." And yet Mao was still not certain. He began Kearns' first day on the squad with a test. "I'm giving you the ticket on Joseph Gallo. Find out all you can about him." "Will do." He asked for the file. Mao told him to dream on. All he had was a brief NYPD intelligence report. According to that, Gallo was the Gambino's consigliere, the number 3 man in the family. "Remember what I said about starting with 0? I wasn't making that up." "Okay, now you've convinced me." Over the next few weeks, Kearns rushed about the city. He worked impossible hours. And one afternoon, after trading war stories with a sergeant from the Manhattan DA's squad, he latched onto a valuable bit of intelligence. Joseph Gallo hung out at a luncheonette in Astoria, Queens. He finally found Speranza's luncheonette and parked his car a discreet block or so away. He didn't see Gallo that day, or the next, but on the 3rd day he spotted his consigliere. Within a week he made his report to Mao. "I spoke to Joe Gallo today." Whatever Mao was working on seemed to require his complete attention. "Yeah, right." But Kearns continued, and now Mao looked up from his desk. "Actually, I had coffee with him. He has angina, takes pills, you know that?" "You're not kidding, are you?" "Hey, would I kid Chairman Mao? Look at this." From a large manila envelope he took out 4 photographs, and, as if he was dealing cards, dropped them one after another on his boss's desk. Each was a shot of the old man in Nikes. Mao was out of his chair and holding the photos in his hand. "This is Joseph Gallo?" "The Gambino consigliere in the flesh." "This is great, just great, Andy. Now we got to start. We got something to look at." All at once Mao had an idea. He grabbed the stapler off his desk and began to staple the photos onto the white plasterboard wall across the room. When he was done, the 4 shots formed a neat eye-level row on the otherwise empty wall. "We're going to build us a family tree. We're going to fill that wall with the faces of all the Gambino bosses. Each and every ugly one of them. How does that strike you, Andy?" "Like a lot of fun." But surveillance work, however ingenious, could only provide a small part of the intelligence base Mao required before he could go on the attack. He needed to know what the Gambino crews were planning. He needed someone on the inside, an informant. The conventional bureau wisdom drummed into each new class at Quantico held that informants aren't born, they're groomed. And Mao could testify to its profundity from his own tense experience, helping to run Willie Boy Johnson, a violent, half-Cherokee, half-Italian Gambino family enforcer his team had inherited from the Queen's DA. Persuading a wise guy to turn on his gumbata, to break his blood oath of silence, involved a lot more than demonstrating that there was something in it for him. The recruiter had to be part shrink, part tough guy, and part benevolent uncle. Now where, Mao wondered anxiously during those first difficult months of his command, where would he ever find the agents with such sly and intuitive skills? Once again, they found him, only this time with a little help from Andy Kearns. Kearns was staking out Joseph Gallo on his home turf in Queens when the ancient consigliere climbed into the back seat of a black Lincoln and headed into the relatively foreign territory of Staten Island. Kearns decided it might be wise to get a little help. Using his car radio phone, he had the bureau switchboard patch him through to the Staten Island field office. "I'm heading toward Highland Boulevard in a gray Chevy and could use some backup." A deep baritone replied, "On our way." He identified himself as Agent Matty Tricorico. For the next 20 minutes or so, with first Kearns' Chevy having the lead and then a yellow Ford taking over, the agents played cat and mouse with the big Lincoln. Finally, the Lincoln pulled into the block-long parking lot of a white stucco-faced restaurant. All at once, another Lincoln pulled up next to them, and the agents waited rock-still in the parking lot for the new arrivals. First the driver stepped out, a tall, muscular man with an absurdly ill-fitting toupee. Tommy Bellotti, Kearns decided in an instant. And where Bellotti went, he was thinking. And then, as if on cue, a bulky figure with a distinctive hawk-like nose emerged from the rear of the car. Paul Castellano, the boss of bosses, the head of the Gambino family, was making his smiling way toward Joseph Gallo. Jesus Christ, thought Kearns as he watched the Don and his consigliere embrace. What have I stumbled into? But before he could even begin to speculate, Tommy Bellotti was suddenly shouting to his boss and gesturing furiously toward the yellow Ford parked at the other end of the lot. Before Kearns' startled eyes, the heavy car doors slammed shut with an angry firmness, and, in tandem, the two big cars screeched away. Kearns watched it all with disbelief. Finally, he ran to the Ford. "How the hell'd they make you?" There were two men in the car. A bald-headed man at the wheel lowered his window just as angry. "How? I'll tell you how. Every wise guy in Staten Island knows this piece of shit yellow Ford. They can spot us a mile away." Kearns just stood there. He was near to shaking with frustration, and the bald-headed man went on. "No point in tailing them now." Kearns agreed, calming down. "We're blown." Kearns thought that if every wise guy in Staten Island knows these two agents, it couldn't hurt to know them too. "This place any good?" A deep voice that Kearns recognized as Tricorico's answered. "Good enough for Big Paul. That's the highest rating you can get on Staten Island." Over lunch, Kearns wanted to learn more about the two agents, but he didn't want his curiosity to come off like the third degree. Dozens of subtle approaches galloped through his mind, but in the end he decided on a simple question. "You guys been together long?" It was the perfect question. Once he asked it, the two men talked non-stop throughout the long meal, except, like a married couple, each partner spoke only about the other. The short, bald-headed one was Frank Sparrow. After 3 years in the Marines, he had gone off to play a lot of football and, as long as it didn't conflict with practice, also attend a few classes at Wagner College in Staten Island. He was only 5'7", but he was built across the chest like an interior lineman, and, as Matty Tricorico told it, once he stepped onto the field, he played non-stop for 4 quarters with the ferocity of Bubba Smith. Tricorico, a star athlete in his own right, had been a lanky basketball forward at Wagner. The two college jocks wound up pledging for the same fraternity, and, perhaps for much the same reasons that opposites invariably attract, had been inseparable ever since. When Sparrow joined the FBI, it didn't take Tricorico long, after a brief and depressing detour teaching junior college English on Staten Island, to follow. From then on, everyone in the Bureau called them the Twins. Kearns decided to ask the question he had been silently formulating for a good part of the meal. "How'd you two like to meet my boss? He's going to take down the Gambinos, the entire family, starting at the top. We could use a couple of guys who know the ropes. At least talk to him. What do you say?" Tricorico and Sparrow did not speak at first. They looked at each other, not at Kearns. Sparrow broke the silence. "You think your boss could come up with something else for us besides that piece of shit yellow Ford?" He might at that." Within a week, the two Staten Island resident officers, Special Agents Matty Tricorico and Frank Sparrow, were assigned to the C-16 squad. And from their first day as part of the team, their primary assignment was a crucial one: get an informant who was on the inside. Of course, the twins realized such recruitments cannot be made on demand. Their approach, Sparrow explained to Mao, would be long-term. "You never press. You plant a seed, that's all. You let the wise guy know very carefully, very offhanded, that if he ever has a problem, if he ever needs help, then maybe I can come up with something that's mutually beneficial." Tricorico would even make a joke of it to a number of Gumbara. You pay your taxes, or at least some of them. Why shouldn't the government give some of that money back? The key was timing. You had to know when the moment was ripe, and then you had to strike. So when the twins heard that the son of a loan shark who worked out of a Gambino hangout in Brooklyn had beaten up some guy in a bar pretty badly, and that since this was his third assault charge he was facing some stiff time, they went to talk with the father. "Maybe we can help you out." The father looked at them stonily. "I don't need any help." "Well, maybe we can help your son." The next day, the twins told Mao that they wanted to open a 137 file. It was the initial bureaucratic step that was required before an informant could be placed on the federal payroll. Word of Mao's squad began to spread through the bureau grapevine, and the word, as one agent recalled it with blunt admiration, was that some hard-nose out of Annapolis was putting together an OC team that was really going to kick butt. Such notoriety attracted some dedicated and unusual recruits. The team was not complete until George Gabriel appeared. He was trained to a marksman's proficiency in a variety of deadly weapons, and his schoolyard street-fighting instincts were reinforced with an arsenal of arcane yet brutal tricks. Mao, despite his often distant, always secretive approach to running his command, managed to pull Gabriel into the thrill of the chase. And so the inner circle was complete. Chairman Mao, the resourceful Kearns, the street-smart twins, the towering Greek, a gang of 5 against 3,000. Mao selected as his initial target one of the Gambino family's most productive crews. They were, according to all he heard and read, a wild, hard-nosed bunch into hijacking, loan-sharking, gambling, and murder. Their headquarters, the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, was just a 10-minute drive from his office, and this offered no small operational advantage. But the clincher was the multitude of reports that identified the crew's newly appointed capo as a comer, a man with both a talent for the trade and a ruthless ambition. The most powerful captain in any family, advised a source known as BQ. The capo's name was John Gotti. John Gotti was crying. Lying in front of him in the open, satin-lined coffin was his 12-year-old son. The guys were scared. They feared their boss was losing it. "Jesus Christ, who the fuck was supposed to do the hair? You fucked up the hair. I'll kill you, you stupid motherfucker. Look at those fucking shoes. You were supposed to shine the shoes. I'll fucking kill you if you don't get those shoes shined right." It had been going on like that all morning. On March 18th, 1980, young Frank, Gotti's middle boy, had borrowed a friend's motorized mini-bike and rode off to have some fun. With evening closing in, Frank headed toward home and supper and homework. At the same time, John Farvara, a 51-year-old service manager for a furniture manufacturer who lived with his wife and 2 adopted children in the house directly behind the Gottis, was also driving home to dinner. As Frank, taking a shortcut, darted out into the street from behind a double-parked dumpster, Farvara's car slammed into him. Gotti had only weeks before proudly shared his son's report card with the Bergen crew. "Look at that, 4 fucking A's. Look what this teacher says about him." Now he lay dead in the street. Who could blame a father for losing control? But there was more. The timing, he ranted in his rambling way to his crew, was too malicious. "Why did it have to happen now? I've fought so hard for every fucking thing. Things are just beginning. Everything is coming together. Why fucking now?" By the spring of 1981, Bruce Mao was getting to be quite an authority on John Gotti. Gotti was a man on the move. He had been born on October 27, 1940, the 5th of what would be 13 children. He was a bright kid with a near-genius 140 IQ score, but he had no time or patience for school. His idol was Albert Anastasia, the self-styled mob king of Brooklyn, and Gotti knew you didn't need a diploma to run with Murder Incorporated. So at 16, he dropped out of Franklin Lane High School and took up with a tough-guy youth gang called the Fulton Rockaway Boys. He was making a small reputation for himself on the streets of Brooklyn. Johnny Boy, the tough talker with the hair-trigger temper, the one who would show up at 11 in the morning dressed like he was going out bar-hopping with his flashy, wide-collared shirts and his tapered pants, the kid who had the other punks jumping when he spoke, a leader. He was just 17, full of himself, convinced he was a real hard case when he took a crazy chance and wound up making some important friends. A small-time hood owed Gotti some money. The deadbeat wasn't a wise guy, but he did hang out with them. When Johnny Boy got the word that the guy was kissing him off, without thinking twice he came after him. He found the hood playing cards in the local wise guy club. He flew in there, upending the table, kneeing the guy in the groin, jumping on him as he fell to the floor, and in a flash his thick hands were so tight around his victim's neck that he would have choked the lousy deadbeat to death if they hadn't pulled him off. It was quite a performance, and before the day was over, the whole neighborhood was talking about it. Angelo Bruno, the Gambino soldier who ran the gambling in that part of Brooklyn, heard about the kid who had come roaring like a bull into the club and sent for him. He was curious.
"You're a ballsy kid, you know that? You could have been killed in there." "Or I just might have killed somebody."
It didn't take Bruno long to realize he had made a real find. He brought Gotti to meet his capo, Carmine Fatico. Fatico, who had started out as a hijacker, was a no-nonsense wise guy from the old school. Dark suit, narrow tie, fedora on his head. When he saw the young punk Bruno had told him so much about come swaggering in, bright purple shirt open nearly to his waist, his pants tight as a girl's, his hair falling in a pomaded curl over his forehead, he started grinding his teeth.
"You look like a fucking guinea."
Gotti tried to take the rebuke, but suddenly he found himself thinking, fuck him, and fuck that little fucking hat on his head. He shot back. "Yeah, but I'm a tough fucking guinea." Fatico smiled.
"I bet you are."
And John Gotti was launched. He became one of Fatico's boys, and, using his mentor's connections, began hijacking trucks leaving Idlewild Airport. But when Fatico wanted to make an example out of two black gamblers who were pocketing a share of the boss's take, Gotti and Willie Boy Johnson, eager to make their bones, went off to teach them a lesson. Both gamblers were found dead, shot in the back of the head. Fatico moved out of the increasingly black community of East New York and set up headquarters in more congenial Ozone Park, a middle-class Italian neighborhood in Queens. He rented 2 adjoining storefronts on 101st Avenue and, inspired by an imagined yearning for a gentleman's life in the great outdoors, christened the bleak and smoky rooms the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. A contract killing landed Gotti in prison, but in his pragmatic world that was a small price, since the murder also got him made. The assignment came from Agnello Della Croce, the Gambino underboss, who was passing it on from the boss himself, Carlo Gambino. 3 months later, Gotti was arrested. When 20 cops, their guns drawn, rushed into a Brooklyn bar and surrounded him, he smiled with an incredulous grin. "Who, me?" He was facing some serious time if convicted. However, Della Croce told him not to worry.
"Carlo says you take the fall, and that's it."
Gotti obeyed, and contrary to either law or logic, Della Croce's confidence proved justified. With the help of Roy Cohn, the attorney Gambino hired, a magnanimous deal was struck with an exceptionally understanding Staten Island District Attorney Office. Gotti was allowed to plead to attempted manslaughter. He served less than 2 years in Greenhaven State Prison. That summer, after he was paroled in 1977, Gotti, along with Fat Angelo Ruggiero and 7 others from the Bergen crew, was inducted by underboss Della Croce into La Cosa Nostra. He pledged his lifelong fidelity to the Mafia and to a new Gambino family boss. Gambino had died in his bed of cancer. His son-in-law, Big Paul Castellano, a former butcher with an 8th-grade education and a self-serving, greedy streak, was now boss of bosses. Yet Gotti was always more closely identified as one of Della Croce's boys. Mr. Neal, as Della Croce was called, took immediately to his new soldier, and Gotti played a role in saving him from jail. The underboss, along with his alleged partner Anthony Plate, had been indicted in 1979 for running a loan sharking operation in Florida. Plate's testimony, Mr. Neal complained, would get both of them sent to prison. Soon Gotti had a suggestion.
"Maybe we should call Tony in for a strategy session."
Then Gotti disappeared, and as events worked out, Tony Plate walked out of a Miami hotel and was never seen again. Della Croce beat the rap, and Johnny Boy returned to the Bergen with a deep Florida suntan.
"Neil and me were like father and son."
Still, many in the family were taken aback when Della Croce, now that Fatico was a ragged 68 and preoccupied with pending trials on hijacking and loan sharking charges, appointed Gotti the acting captain of the Bergen crew. Johnny Boy set out to prove himself. He was determined to rule, and if necessary, to make his boys crawl. So when Anthony Moschatiello, a particularly dim-witted soldier in his crew, dared not to return one of his calls, Gotti laid down the law. He began slowly when he caught up with the hapless Moschatiello, but his anger kept building. "I called your fucking house 5 times yesterday. Now, if your wife thinks you're a fucking Dunsky and you're going to disregard my fucking phone calls, I'm going to blow you and that fucking house up." A few months later, Carmine Fatico officially retired. John Gotti was now the captain of the Bergen crew, and at his son's funeral. John Favara, the neighbor who had had the misfortune to run over Frank Gotti, disappeared. C-16 learned from their informants he would never be found. Mao's course of action took shape slowly. Through extensive review of informant reports, Mao found sufficient testimony to persuade a judge to authorize electronic surveillance of the Bergen's loan sharking and gambling rackets. An informant had once thrown out, almost as an aside, that Angelo Ruggiero had a phone in his Howard Beach home that was listed in his teenage daughter's name. It was, Fat Angelo told the snitch cryptically, his safe phone. Mao decided that what was safe for the bad guys might be a good bet for his team, too. One afternoon in the first week of November 1981, 2 FBI techies dressed as Con Ed repairmen paid a visit to the Ruggiero residence to investigate the cause of a blackout that had mysteriously affected the entire block. By the time they left, power had been restored, and a teenager's Pink Princess phone had been wired. From the first day it was activated, the tap produced fascinating, provocative results. Ruggiero then moved to a new home in Cedarhurst, farther out in suburban Long Island. But in April 1982, microphones hidden in the track lighting stretching across the sun porch of the newly renovated Cedarhurst house were switched on, and the C-16 team was once again eavesdropping. Only now things were a lot juicier. Ruggiero was boldly having business meetings over the dining table of his new house. Over the next busy stretch of months, the C-16 squad discovered, to both their personal amusement and professional satisfaction, that Ruggiero was incapable of keeping his mouth shut. One of the Bergen boys, John Carneglia, was heard complaining about him. "Dial any 7 numbers and there's a 50-50 chance that Angelo will answer the phone." The C-16 squad could only add, "Amen." The conversations were wide-ranging. Ange complained to Gene Gotti about his brother Johnny Boy's out-of-control gambling binges. The capo had shelled out $90,000 over one painful football weekend. Or, going against family rules, and for that matter common sense, he was on the phone disparaging Big Paul. Mao came to a strategic realization of his assault on the Gambino family for the next decade. Whenever possible, he would pepper them with microphones. And then, suddenly, Angelo Ruggiero stopped talking. In late June, the house abruptly became silent. The microphones listened in vain. After a rapid series of crash meetings with his informants, Mao discovered the reason for the silence. Fritz Giovanelli, an expansive Genovese capo who was celebrated in the mob for his valuable ties into the democratic machine, had handed Ruggiero a manila envelope. Inside the envelope were about 30 pages, and on the first page was the heading, "In the matter of the application of the United States of America for an order authorizing the interception of oral communications." When Ruggiero read on, he saw his name and the address of his home in Cedarhurst. Later that afternoon, a starkly pale Ruggiero was in the Bergen frantically waving the document about as if it were a flag and muttering to anyone who would listen, "I'm fucked, I'm really fucked." Through extensive informant contacts, a sizable cashier's check, a search warrant, and finally a successful raid, Mao obtained the document. Mao was somber when he confided to his inner circle in a locked-door meeting in his office later that day. The authorization document that had made its way to Ruggiero was the handwritten draft affidavit FBI agent Donald McCormick had put together for the squad's secretary to type. It could only have been stolen from one place, C-16's own files. They never found the thief. All Mao could do was put all the small clues he gathered into a new file, As the weeks went by, he added snippets of gossip, unproven suspicions, wild theories. He kept this file, which in time would come to be known to the squad as the Mole File, locked in his office. It was a catalog of his worst fears. Other unforeseen consequences of the Ruggiero bugs also began to build ominously. Mao had discovered that the Bergen crew was dealing drugs. The evidence was all over the tapes. So steady was Mao's confidence as the case against the Bergen crew progressed that Mao even volunteered to share some of the details with Bonavolanta. We got Ruggiero, Johnny Carneglia, Gene Gotti, all of them cold. What about John? Not yet. We know he's involved. They wouldn't be dealing without his permission, but so far we can't prove it. But could Paul Castellano prove it? Big Paul had a simple, well-known family rule. He called it his first commandment. If you dealt, you died. So when Ruggiero learned his house was bugged, he had panicked. And it only got worse when, in the winter of 1983, a series of indictments based on hundreds of hours of FBI tapes were issued. Angelo Ruggiero, John Carneglia, and Gene Gotti were identified as the organizers, supervisors, and managers of a heroin ring. John Gotti was not charged. But Paul Castellano was still suspicious. He sent word to Ruggiero that as soon as the government made the tapes available to the lawyers, he wanted to hear them, and he had warned John Gotti. "Johnny, you better prove that you weren't involved." All of which got Gotti thinking, it was either kill or be killed. In the tense, preoccupied months that followed the indictments, a small item ran in the papers, and it went unnoticed by both Bruce Mao and John Gotti. It was a Metro brief, and it told a tragic story. On the rainy afternoon of December 3rd, 1984, William Peist, a 39-year-old off-duty police detective, was driving in from Brooklyn with his wife and mother-in-law across the rain-slicked Manhattan Bridge, and his car stalled. The cars backed up behind him were honking, so he decided it would be helpful to arrange flares around his Plymouth. He got out and started walking in the rain to the rear of his car. At precisely that moment, a van pulled out impatiently from the lane of vehicles lined behind his Plymouth and sped forward. Suddenly, the driver saw Peist and tried to brake, but on the slippery roadway there was no traction. The van skidded into Peist. William Peist's leg was removed up to nearly his thigh. 6 months would be spent in a body cast stretching to his waist. It was while he was recovering at the NYU hospital that Inspector Aaron Rosenthal, his commanding officer from the Public Morals Squad, came to see him. "How you doing, Billy?" "Getting by. I'm going to get back on the job, though I guess it won't be the PM. Figured they'll give me some sort of desk job." Rosenthal, who had a large and generous heart, figured it would be polite to play along. "Probably. Like what?" "Oh, I've been giving that some thought. Not much else for me to do. I've been thinking a lot about intelligence. I might really like that. The intelligence squad just might be my ticket." Meanwhile, as the C-16 team moved forward, they learned about a grand jury probe by an assistant U.S. attorney in Brooklyn, Diane Giacalone, that threatened to undermine irrevocably all they had done so far. Her target was the Bergen crew. At Mao's urging, Edward MacDonald, chief of the organized crime strike force in the Eastern District, wrote a memo to Giacalone's superiors in the Justice Department. Her case, he flatly stated, was especially weak. Further, if the Bergen crew was acquitted, and he was confident that they might very well be, they could be immunized against future RICO prosecutions. Under federal double jeopardy statutes, they could not be tried for the same enterprise crimes again. That was Mao's great fear. After having climbed so far up a steep and slippery mountain, his team would have to start again at the base. But Giacalone would not be deterred, and more troublesome, her superiors were not inclined to pull her back. C-16 refused to cooperate with her, as she, despite protests, continued to present her case to the grand jury. But Giacalone persisted. She was determined to get her indictment. On March 25, 1985, a sealed document, United States of America versus Agnello della Croce et al., was voted against the Gambino family underboss and 9 of his men. The proceedings in Judge Eugene H. Nickerson's courtroom in Brooklyn had all gone pretty routinely. Della Croce in the hospital for chemotherapy treatments pled not guilty by telephone. John Gotti, his brother Gene, and the others were all released on bail. And then it was their longtime buddy Willie Boy Johnson's turn. Giacalone told the judge that he should be jailed immediately. No conditions of bail would secure his appearance. The reason is that Mr. Johnson has been an informant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation for a period of over 15 years, including a period up through the present time. John Gotti turned toward Johnson.
So you're the reason we're here, huh?
Willie Boy did not answer. He continued to look straight at the judge, his hands clenched very tightly. Tattooed on the knuckles of one fist was the word true. On the other was the word love. He was 51 years old, a former boxer, a man the family used when they wanted to teach somebody a lesson, and he could not stop shaking. Members of the C-16 team watching from the back of the courtroom were stunned. It was one thing to indict one of their top-echelon informants, but it was another, very dangerous thing to reveal his role. Mao felt besieged. Wiretaps had been leaked. Affidavits had been stolen from his files. Indictments had been rushed. And now his informant had been betrayed. On his orders, C-16's operational detachment from the rest of law enforcement intensified. And the truth was, the team preferred it that way. Yet all the while, in those frustrating and combative months before the Della Croce wake, the FBI microphones continued to do their job. They listened. The bug had been on, or up, as they say, when Angelo Ruggiero and John Gotti came on June 8, 1985, to confer with their ghostly pale and fragile underboss, Della Croce. Their concern was the Ruggiero heroin tapes. They had been released to Ruggiero's attorneys, and Big Paul Castellano still wanted them. Fat Angelo was insistent.
If you two never bother with me again, I ain't giving them tapes up. I can't.
But Gotti's voice was even.
While he's the boss, you have to do what he tells you.
And Della Croce lectured from his sickbed.
You don't understand La Cosa Nostra. And what does Cosa Nostra mean? Cosa Nostra means that the boss is your boss.
Ruggiero was beyond all that. If Castellano got the tapes and heard he was dealing drugs, Big Paul would have him killed immediately. Or maybe first he would whack Gotti, then him. Della Croce was 71 years old. The chemotherapy had taken its toll, and, he had to realize, was still not doing enough. He looked up wearily at Ruggiero and Gotti.
I've been telling Paul, the guy can't give you the tapes because his family is on there. I've been trying to make you get away with these tapes, but Jesus Christ almighty, I can't stop the guy from always bringing it up. Unless I tell the guy, why don't you go fuck yourself?
No one spoke for a moment, until Della Croce, his voice suddenly stronger, went on.
Then we know what we gotta do then. We go and roll it up, and we go to war. If it has to come to that, it'll come to that.
Gotti and Ruggiero agreed, and so did Mao when he heard the tape the next day. When Della Croce died, Gotti's world, while always precarious, grew increasingly strained. Big Paul was still demanding the Ruggiero tapes, and perhaps an even more troublesome concern, had begun threatening to disband Gotti's crew. In the anxious days following their underboss's death, the whole Bergen gang began to feel the family tensions mounting dangerously. His brother Gene complained as the two men sat in the Bergen a week after the Della Croce wake.
Everybody's running scared, John. Well, fuck 'em, we ain't.
Gotti's mind was set. He had decided to make his move. But shrewdly aware that with this decision his very life was now on the line, he, for once, reined in his volcanic temper. John Gotti was not only setting out to assassinate Paul Castellano, he was also determined to replace him. Gotti would be the boss of bosses, or he would be dead. Discreetly, yet methodically, he was lining up support from the other families. He chose not, however, to reach out directly to his potential conspirators. Instead, for those hushed initial discussions, he dispatched his emissaries. He was already, it was said, acting like the boss. Now that the plot to kill Castellano was moving forward, The circle of Gambino family conspirators was expanding. There were 5 factions committed: Gotti and his Bergen gang, Sammy the Bull Gravano and a crew of hard cases who hung out with him at Tolly's in Brooklyn, Joe Piney Armone, a gray-haired capo who had promised to bring the old Gambino guys around, Robert DiBernardo, who didn't have a crew but was a prodigious moneymaker, and Frank DiCicco, a happy-go-lucky captain who was one of Castellano's Goombas, or so the boss believed. Together, these plotters had formed a coalition they called the Fist. They wanted to believe they were that tough. But they also understood, let enough time go by, and even the tightest of fists will become unclenched or pried apart. Killing the boss was one thing. Getting away with it, Gotti understood, was another. Now that he was determined to whack Paul, now that his fist of conspirators was clenched, his great concern was over what would happen after Paul went down. If the other families turned against him, there would be war. Therefore, each of the conspirators had an assignment. It didn't take them long to make their reports to Gotti. Joe Piney Armone provided a summary of his meeting with Joseph Gallo, the Gambino family consigliere, and with some of the Genovese crowd on the west side. "I'll be able to control them." Sammy Gravano and Frank DiCicco reached out to Vic Amuso and Anthony Gascasso of the Lucchese family. "You won't have a problem with those people." Gotti himself contacted John Messina, the underboss of the Bonanno family. They had done business together in the past, and Messina said there was no reason why they wouldn't be working together in the future. Angelo Ruggiero contacted Jerry Lang, the Colombo family underboss. A day later, Lang sent a message to Gotti. "What the hell you waiting for?" It was, no doubt, in the increasingly tense days after Della Croce's death, the very question that was weighing heavily on all the conspirators' minds. Yet just when it seemed their moment would never come, an excited Frankie DiCicco announced that Castellano had summoned him to a dinner next week at Sparks, a steakhouse in Manhattan. By the end of the day, Gotti sent word. The moment had come. On a frigidly cold evening, December 15, 1985, 10 faces stared at Gotti from around a long, richly polished wooden conference table in the basement below the offices of Sammy Gravano's construction company. Seated close to Gotti, near the head, were the original conspirators, Sammy Gravano, Angelo Ruggiero, and Frank DiCicco. They already knew the score. They had met with Gotti earlier in the day and helped him formulate the plan of attack. But the hard cases down at the end of the table, Eddie Lino, Fat Sally Scala, Vinny Artuso, Johnny Carneglia, Tony Roach Rampino, Joe Watts, and Iggy Alogna, could only guess at what serious business was at hand. It was Gotti's show, and he would run it as somberly as a board of directors meeting. He did not resort to temper, nor did he attempt to lighten the occasion with his charm. "We're going to do a piece of work tomorrow. It has to be done." He went on in this unembroidered way to say there would be 2 targets. The plan was to hit them at 5 in the evening as they arrived for an appointment at a restaurant in the city. Then he rose and began walking around the table. He put his hands firmly on Lino's shoulders. It was an affectionate gesture, but its suddenness seemed to take Lino by surprise. Gotti moved on to Fat Sally, Vinny, and Johnny Carnegs. He stood behind each of them, and one after another brought his large hands down on their shoulders. He could have been choosing sides for a basketball game. "You guys are the shooters." He would give out the exact assignments tomorrow afternoon. Gotti concluded by repeating 5 words he had said at the start. "It has to be done." John Gotti and Sammy Bull were telling them to do something. That should be reason enough to risk their lives. On December 16, 1985, at just before noon, Paul Castellano kissed the maid, his mistress, Gloria Olardi, goodbye, walked across the black-and-white checkerboard marble floor of the front hall, and out the oversized double doors of his mansion on the top of Toad Hill. Tommy Bellotti was waiting in the circular drive in his black Lincoln with the tinted windows. Bellotti put the car in gear, and they headed down the hill. It would be Christmas Eve in 8 days, and Mao had a lot to get done before he caught the plane home to Des Moines. The last thing he wanted to do was share his hard-won street knowledge with a room full of his quote-unquote fellow law enforcement community at the seminar that night. particularly after the Giacalone indictment and betrayal of Willie Boyd Johnson, which would always be unforgivable. Across the borough, just a 10-minute ride away, John Gotti was having his own rough moment, only it had brought him to a full-blown rage.
You call this white? You fucking colorblind? This is yellow, you fucking idiot! Yellow! Fucking yellow!
Days earlier, Gotti had come up with the idea that all the shooters should wear the identical disguise. It would make it more difficult, he explained, for a bystander to identify any one individual. Ruggiero had done a resourceful job with the headgear. He had come up with 4 bulky Russian-style fur hats. He had also provided suitable coats. They were a neutral tannish color and 3/4 length, long enough to hide a weapon. The problem was that Fat Ange had been able to come up with only 3 identical coats. The 4th was approximately the same length and cut, but it was also definitely a bright yellow. Gotti took a long look.
John, I couldn't find anything else. It's almost the same.
After a while, Gotti was once again in control.
Yellow, motherfucking yellow. It'll fucking have to do.
As Gotti drove his Lincoln down the block, he passed Sparks. The sidewalks were filled with people hurrying home from work, going off Christmas shopping, heading out for a night in the city. Gravano looked out of the car's tinted windows and saw 2 men in light coats, fur hats pulled low on their heads, huddled near a street lamp on one side of the Sparks canopy. A similarly dressed pair was standing casually on the other side. The car proceeded down the block, and for an instant Gravano glimpsed a familiar figure standing across from the restaurant. The Christmas lights strung from a row of bare beeches had caught the gaunt features of Tony Roach. The car continued to move toward 2nd Avenue and turned right, but not before the headlights had picked up, for just a moment, 3 more backup shooters. Gotti drove down 46th Street. There was a space on the corner. The 2 men sat in the car waiting. The engine was running. Gotti's hands were on the steering wheel. Sammy gripped the walkie-talkie. In his belt, beneath his unbuttoned leather jacket, was the .357. Then all at once Gravano looked out the tinted passenger side window, and there they were, stopped for a red light at the intersection of 46th Street and 3rd Avenue. The dome light was on inside the car, and he could see Castellano and Bellotti talking. Bellotti was this close to him. Gravano could have opened his window and snatched the toupee off his head. It was eerie. Gravano spoke into the walkie-talkie.
They're the first car. They're stopped at the light.
The light turned green.
They're coming through.
The Lincoln crossed 3rd Avenue and stopped directly in front of the restaurant. There was a no parking sign on the street lamp, but Bellotti ignored it. He turned off the engine and hurried out of the driver's seat. He was going to hold open the door for his boss, but Castellano was impatient. He opened his own door. The moment Castellano stepped from the car, 2 men in raincoats and fur hats rushed toward him. They had their arms extended. One man held a .32 caliber semi-automatic revolver, the other a .38, and they were firing rapidly. From the driver's side of the car, Bellotti saw the men moving toward Castellano, and on instinct he hunched slightly to look through the car window for a better view. At that instant, the 2 other men who had circled quietly behind him began firing. Bullets ripped into Castellano. He was shot 5 times in the head. Blood oozed furiously from his ears, his nose, his mouth. A bullet caught him in the chest, just above his tie clip. He slumped to the sidewalk, a dead man falling back against the car door. One black leather glove was still clutched in his right hand. When the shots broke out, people on the street started screaming. A woman cried as the shooting continued. 4 bullets smashed into Tommy Bellotti's skull. Another 4 shots sliced through his back and into his chest. He fell like a giant tree, teetering at first, swaying slightly, and then landing flat on his back with a thud. He lay with his arms spread wide, a dead man, his blood soaking the street. One of the shooters still came at Castellano. He got to one knee and pressed his revolver directly against the dead man's temple. He fired once, a coup de grace, and the final bullet exploded into the skull of the man who was no longer the boss of bosses. A bartender inside Sparks called 911. "Someone's been shot." A 1010 transmission went out over the police radio. "Shots fired, vicinity of 46th and 3rd. All over Midtown, police cars hit their flashing lights and sirens as they sped through the city traffic. When Gotti drove past the restaurant, Gravano looked out the window at Bellotti's body. It was laying face up. Sammy looked back at Gotti. "Tommy's gone." Bruce Mao's beeper went off as he was driving home, probably somebody wondering why he hadn't shown at the Blakey lecture. Then he heard the radio announcer's voice. Paul Castellano, the head of the Gambino crime family, had been gunned down on a midtown street just minutes ago. Two troubling thoughts occupied his mind. First, was this war? Was the Castellano hit just the beginning of an all-out conflict? And second, but not by much, how was he going to explain to his family that they shouldn't count on his coming home this Christmas after all? At the seminar, so many beepers rang out in unison that they formed a steady hum. John Gotti was at home in Howard Beach in his silk pajamas watching a movie on cable television when, around 10 o'clock, 2 homicide detectives rang his doorbell. He looked incredulously at the 2 cops at his door.
Paul got hit? Gee, that's too bad.
He showed, they reported, no emotion. Andy Kearns took the hat off his head and put it on the dashboard of his Oldsmobile. It was the safety signal, and he wanted to make sure it would not be missed. It said, "Come on in. Everything's warm and cozy." Then he checked that the visor on the passenger side of his Oldsmobile had not slipped down. It was an unnecessary worry, he knew, but he liked to be certain. A lowered visor was the counter signal, "Keep on going. Don't stop until you're back in your own home with the door double-locked behind you." The visor, of course, was up. Frankie was the code name for the informer, or TE, Kearns had been running for the past 13 months. He was a beefy, darkly handsome, happy-go-lucky wise guy. Frankie, an old hand after all the months, knew the drill. He parked a few blocks away and walked to the lot. It was safer not to have his car near Kearns. Then he climbed into the back seat. There was a lot more room in the rear in case someone unexpected drove by and he needed to do a duck dive. Kearns turned in his seat so that he was looking at Frankie straight in the face. He didn't even attempt to disguise his concern. "What's happening, Frankie? We got a war on our hands?"
"A coronation's more like it."
"Who?" Frankie enjoyed his advantage. He waited a melodramatic moment.
"John Gotti. The word is he whacked Paul. Now he's going to try and take his place."
Kearns was incredulous.
"Gotti? He got the weight to pull this off?"
Frankie shrugged philosophically.
"Everything's very quiet. John's looking very good."
It had been a long day after an even longer night for Bruce Mao. By the time Andy Kearns walked into his office, 20 hectic hours had passed since the Castellano shooting, and a beleaguered Mao felt as if he had spent every frantic minute of each of those hours with a phone in his hand. Kearns, clearly relishing the moment, ripped the mugshot of Castellano from the top of the pyramid on the wall chart. In its place, he put a headshot of a smirking John Gotti. Mao burst out, "You're kidding me, Gotti?" Kearns nodded, but Mao was still not persuaded. "The family will never let him get away with it." Mao's firm prediction was, in the end, nothing more than wishful thinking. John Gotti's control was masterful. His first move was to solidify his support within the family. He had Joseph Gallo, the cranky 71-year-old consigliere who was ostensibly head of the Gambinos now that both the boss and underboss were dead, call for a sit-down. It was a summons that provoked fear. The meeting held a minefield of possibilities. It might turn out to be, the captains worried, a call to battle. Gallo would issue his orders to avenge Castellano's death. Or it might be a free-for-all, either with Gotti or with the old-timers, and only those who made the right decision would get out alive. Gotti, of course, counted on all these concerns. They would make his intervention, the peacemaker stepping in to head the family in a time of turmoil, so much easier. When he heard that 2 of the captains had immediately sent contrived regrets to attend the sit-down, Gotti's spirits soared, and he gloated to Sammy the Bull.
"They're sweating bullets."
The meeting was held in Caesar's, Sammy the Bull's place, an ornate Italian restaurant not more than a 10-minute stroll from Sparks. Downstairs, the capos were led into a dining room that was very rococo, perhaps someone's vision of a Venetian palazzo. At the head of the table, waiting for the 21 capos to take their seats, was Joseph Gallo, and flanking him like bookends were John Gotti and Frank DeCicco. But it was Gallo's evening. This, too, was on Gotti's orders, and it was another inspired tactic. The fact that the family consigliere was running things allowed the appearance of an orderly transition to be maintained. Gallo spoke like a weary man caught up in a great and perplexing mystery.
We don't know who killed Paul, but we're investigating it.
All at once, the tension seemed to slip out of the room. So that's the way it's going to be, the captains immediately realized, most with relief. No taking to the mattresses, no cowboying through the streets, just business as usual. If any bull-headed capo full of righteous anger was going to declare, "Cut the crap, we know Gotti killed our boss and he and his crew got to pay," now would be the time. No one said a word or made a careless sound. The silence was intense. At last Gallo spoke again.
How about we get something to eat?
What about the other families? A commission rule had been broken. The head of a family had been hit without permission. It was one thing to extract vengeance against John Gotti, a renegade capo, but it would be another to challenge the Don of the Gambino family. Despite the urgency of these ambitions, Gotti also understood that he could not simply proclaim himself boss. The other families would not tolerate such a rebellious disregard of La Cosa Nostra rules. For his position to be accepted by the commission, he would have to be elected. Gotti didn't want anyone later claiming they weren't notified or that he had prevented them from coming to the vote. The election was held just days before Christmas. Once again, Joseph Gallo presided.
The purpose of this sit-down was to elect a new head of the family to replace Paul Castellano. Who would like to begin the nominations?
Frankie DeCicco shot up from his chair, and all eyes in the room fixed on him. It had been Gotti's idea that Frankie should be the first to speak. He knew that there were some people in the family who would prefer Frankie with his ties to the old guard as boss, and he wanted to let them know straight off where Frankie's loyalties lay.
I nominate John Gotti.
When he sat down, everyone understood a deal had been made, and it would be foolish, even dangerous, to oppose it. Now Joe Butch rose.
I nominate John Gotti.
Then Frankie Dapp.
I nominate John Gotti.
One after another, the capos stood, until everyone at the table, 23 loud voices, had spoken. Each had nominated John Gotti. It was unanimous. Within 8 days of the murder of Paul Castellano, John Gotti, a 45-year-old hijacker from Queens, had replaced him as boss of bosses of the Gambino family. The Christmas Eve party at the Ravenite was a coronation. John sat sipping Chivas in the back room, under a picture of his mentor, Agnello Della Croce. Across from him was his newly appointed underboss, Frank DeCicco. Proud of his reputation as a stand-up guy, Gotti wanted the word to get around that he had moved quickly to cover his debt. Other debts had been generously repaid. Sammy Bull and Fat Ange had been made captains. He had also hand-picked and then dispatched a delegation announcing his appointment to each of the 4 other families. Their responses had been swift. John Gotti has our blessings. He may represent his family on the commission. There was, however, one small cautionary demurral. The Genoveses, who had done a lot of business with Big Paul, had taken care to explain to Joe Piney that a commission rule had been broken. Some day, they promised, someone would have to pay. But other than that, things had moved just as Gotti had planned. One by one, the capos were led in to pay their respects to their new godfather. They kissed John Gotti on each cheek and vowed their eternal loyalty. In return, the new head of the Gambino family gave them his blessings. Before each man was ushered into the back room, he handed an envelope to Gene Gotti. Inside was a Christmas present for his new Don. By the time the evening was over, Gotti had received nearly $2 million in cash. And that, he knew, was just the beginning.
Nobody rolls 7s and 11s forever.
It was a quote John Gotti was fond of. It didn't take long for the new godfather's run of luck to come skidding to a halt, just as, it seemed, Diane Giacalone's streak was beginning. The previous March, 9 long months ago, Gotti's name, as well as 8 other wise guys who hung out at the Bergen, had been tacked onto a federal indictment aimed at Neil Della Croce. Who could have predicted that by January both Della Croce and Castellano would be dead and buried? On January 13, 1986, John Gotti, the head of the family for just 3 weeks, found himself identified as the lead defendant. The press, hoping for a look at the man rumored to be the new godfather, was waiting. "They say you're the boss of the Gambino family."
I'm the boss of my family.
All at once the reporters wondered what was up. Who is this guy? But in the next instant, his timing perfect, Gotti flashed a coy, twinkling smile and went on.
My wife and kids at home.
Without breaking stride, cheered on by the appreciative laughter of his entourage of lawyers and bodyguards, Gotti continued his walk to the courtroom. Many of the reporters were smiling, too. This was too good to be true. His face beaming like a man who was enjoying a very good joke, the new boss of bosses disappeared inside the courtroom where he and his co-defendants were accused of taking part in 3 murders. The trial finally began in April, but after 4 argumentative days in the midst of jury selection, Frankie DeCicco managed to get his boss one more postponement. He was blown up. It was a warm spring Sunday, April 13, 1986, and DeCicco had spent the afternoon at the Veterans and Friends Social Club, Jimmy Brown's place on 86th Street in Brooklyn. After he climbed in his Buick, someone watching pushed a button, and the car exploded. The force of the blast propelled DeCicco through the windshield. He landed on the sidewalk across from the restaurant, in pieces. One foot was found up the block hooked around a parking meter. An arm landed on the awning above a bakery, the hand, all its thick fingers intact, raised as if in a final wave. Gotti took one look at the charred and twisted car, and the message Joe Piney had passed on months ago from the Genovese family suddenly seemed very important. Someday, someone will have to pay for Big Paul's death. Judge Eugene Nickerson felt the publicity was contaminating. He ordered the trial delayed until August. A small argument with a rudely impatient refrigerator repairman had set in motion the events that wound up landing the Don, just 1 month after Frank DeCicco's death, in jail. The incident itself was trivial street-corner stuff and years old, played out in a rough and tumble part of Queens. On a September afternoon in 1984, Romuald Pajkic returned to his car from cashing his $325 paycheck and found a double-parked Lincoln blocking his way. It didn't take long for Pajkic, who was 6'2" and a bruiser to boot, a guy who had been busted in his time for possession of a weapon and assault, to work himself into a real state. He got into his car and started pounding on the horn. When no one rushed out to move the Lincoln, he just leaned on the horn. That got Frankie Coletta's attention.
You see a guy parked in front of the cozy corner of Lincoln, you got to know the guy's connected. Everyone in the neighborhood would figure it that way, or maybe this big oaf didn't care.
Coletta decided to teach him some manners. He just walked on over to the car, reached through the open window, and caught Pajkic with a left jab in the face. That got Pajkic to stop pounding the horn, and to teach him a lesson, Coletta deftly grabbed the wad of bills he saw sticking out of the stunned man's shirt pocket. Coletta was strolling back to the bar when Pajkic rushed him. He came at him like a charging bull, but Coletta stood his ground, and, his arms moving like pistons, he threw a couple of sharp combinations. That shook Pajkic up, but he didn't go down. At that moment, John Gotti came out of the cozy corners.
What the fuck is going on?
Pajkic turned to the well-dressed man and began complaining that his cash had been stolen. Gotti walked right up to him and looked him in the face.
Get the fuck out of here.
In case Pajkic hadn't gotten the message, he reached underneath his coat as if he were preparing to draw something out. Pajkic decided he should forget about the money and just leave. But 10 minutes later, he was on the corner of 72nd Street and Grand Avenue, complaining to Officer Raymond Doyle and Sergeant Thomas Donahue. At the precinct, Gotti was booked and quickly released. The case had not come to trial for nearly 2 years. In those 2 years, Castellano had been murdered, Gotti had taken his place, and Romuald Pajkic had figured out whose Lincoln had been blocking his car. A front-page New York Post headline incisively and a bit archly summed up Pajkic's testimony. I forgotti. The judge had no choice but to grant the defense motion to dismiss the charges. The boss of bosses emerged from the courtroom a free man. But not for long. In April, on the very day Judge Nickerson had ordered a postponement of the federal racketeering trial due to all the complicating attention that the DeChico bombing had focused on the case, Diane Giacalone moved to have Gotti's bail revoked. She argued that while free on bail, Gotti had managed to intimidate a state witness, Romuald Pajkic. The judge's opinion supported her claim, and the Metropolitan Correctional Center was Gotti's home for the next 10 months. But he was still the boss. Gotti was determined to make sure his family did not forget who was in charge. When Ange and his brother Gene told him that some of the guys were talking cocky behind his back, he made up his mind to teach someone a lesson, and at the same time to teach them all a lesson. Sitting in his cell, with lots of time to think about it, he decided to make an example out of Robert DiBernardo. There was also a practical side to Gotti's rage. DB was sitting on a fortune. He was into porn, pulling in millions of dollars each year, and he was also making money hand over fist by shaking down the construction unions. With DB out of the way, Gotti could put his own management team into place, one that would be a lot more generous with the CEO's compensation package. Ruggiero shared the boss's order with Sammy Gravano. After all, Sammy was the Iceman. But Sammy, for once, was reluctant. He and DeBee were friends. It was John's orders, Ruggiero said flatly. This has to be done. If it has to be, it has to be, realized Gravano. It no doubt crossed his shrewd mind that with DeBee gone, he would be single-handedly running the unions for the family. Sammy Bull met DeBee a couple of mornings a week at around 11 at Sammy's place on Stillwell Avenue. But when DeBee showed up at Stillwell Avenue on the morning of June 5th, Sammy had no time for his friend. I got an appointment. How about you come back later, say 5:30, 6, we'll have a cup of coffee, discuss things. Sammy was careful not to make too big a deal about it, and DeBee was unsuspecting. Fine with me. As soon as DeBee drove off to Manhattan in his white Mercedes, Sammy was on the phone. Round up Huck and old man Peruta. We got a piece of business to do this afternoon. When DeBee returned to Stillwell Avenue shortly after 5, the secretary was already gone. Tommy Carbonaro, Huck to his friends, was waiting by the door. How you doing? Sammy's waiting for you downstairs. DeBee nodded. I know the way. DeBee found Sammy, along with old man Peruta, sitting at the long table in the brightly lit basement office. He took a seat across from them, his back toward the door. Peruta went to get coffee for the others from the Mr. Coffee Maker that was on a gray steel file cabinet behind DeBee. He opened the cabinet. Inside was a .38 revolver fitted with a silencer. He spoke as he walked toward DeBee. Sugar? Before DeBee could answer, Peruta shot him once in the back of the head. There was a red hole about the size of a nickel, just below where DeBee's hair was starting to thin. The next shot tore his skull apart. Pieces went flying all over the room as if a ripe melon had been smashed with a sledgehammer. Sammy complained as he picked pieces of his friend's brain off his clothes. Jesus, that was fucking messy. So the months in jail didn't seem to bother John Gotti. Easy time, I can do it standing on my head. When the trial finally began in August, he didn't seem at all threatened by the government's wide-ranging case. He was charged with being involved in 3 murders. He was facing life imprisonment, and there were 3 wise guys who had cut a deal and were now waiting to testify against him. But Gotti did not appear to be intimidated. After the jury was selected and the opening arguments were about to be delivered, Gotti showed the reporters that his confidence continued to remain unshakable. They got no case. If my kids ever lied as much as these guys lied, they'd have no dinner. And all the while Bruce Mao watched from a distance and wondered what ace John Gotti had hidden up his sleeve. The twins were in a ferocious mood when they heard the latest report from the doe-eyed beauty identified in the Bureau's informant files as codename Easter. Easter had been making reports for nearly a year when she finally delivered this one small bit of gossip from her boyfriend, the capo. She had, Easter said, asked her lover about John Gotti's court case. Looks bad, huh? He had laughed. Forget about it. It's in the bag. So she was intrigued. You never know. Oh, I know. It's in the fucking bag. We bought a juror. It would be years before Mao would learn the whole story. The facts, as they later would be pieced together by C-16, were these. Juror number 11, a 53-year-old ex-Marine named George Pape, happened to be a lifelong friend of a man named Bosko Radonic, and Radonic, a Yugoslav-born thug who headed a bunch of Irish contract killers known as the Westies, happened to be an occasional business partner of John Gotti. The trial had just begun when Radonic went to see Sammy Gravano and suggested a deal. For a price, his friend would vote to acquit. Gravano delivered $60,000. It was a real bargain, and it looked even better once it was learned that the jurors had chosen juror number 11 to be their foreman. Yet even if Mao had known all these details at that time, it was still unlikely that he would have decided on another course of action. How could he announce that he had learned a juror had been bribed without revealing his source? Giacalone had already demonstrated her willingness to sacrifice informants. Who could guarantee that she would not reveal code-name Easter's identity in open court? Operationally and morally, Mao had no choice but to keep his peace. Whatever the ultimate reason, Bruce Mao sat back and let Diane Giacalone slug it out with a very confident John Gotti. While few FBI field agents relished courtroom duty, George Gabriel's distaste for such a static, tedious assignment was especially strong. Gabriel saw his role in C-16 as that of a snarling, in-your-face gangbuster, but Mao felt it was high time that Gabriel, the new agent on the squad, got to watch John Gotti in action. Gabriel's first small shock came during the opening arguments. He took one look at Bruce Cutler, Gotti's hand-picked lawyer, and thought, there's a fighter. And indeed, as if from the first bell, Cutler came out swinging. He marched over to the blackboard where Diane Giacalone, in her opening statement, had very meticulously sketched a Gambino family tree and, with one swift swipe of a heavy hand, cut a wide path right through it. It was a brutal gesture, and it succeeded in capturing the jury's attention. The government's case, he bellowed, was fantasy. It tells you about a secret world that doesn't exist. The next day, as the trial moved on, John Gotti caught George Gabriel's eye, made his hand into a gun, and mouthed, "Bang." Gabriel, sitting in the first row, did not hesitate. He simply caught the imaginary bullet in midair, and then, a man of steel, he defiantly crushed it in a vice-like fist. That brought a smile to John Gotti's face. He motioned for Gabriel to come over. "You a cop?" "FBI." The Don considered for a moment. It was as if he was looking at Gabriel from another angle. "What's your name, Fed?" "George Gabriel." "Well, Gabriel, you tell Mao that I'm going to beat this case. When I walk out of here, I want him to come and see me. You tell him, just him and me will settle things." Gabriel's smile was gone. "Bruce Mao isn't your only worry, John. Don't forget about me. You walk out of here, I promise you, I'm going to be all over you." The two men were inches apart, eyes locked. But Gotti simply slipped into another mood. His hostility seemed to evaporate. "Hey, you just sit back and enjoy the trial. It's going to be quite a show, that I guarantee you." Gotti, this time at least, was a man of his word. The trial was quite a show. Diane Giacalone never succeeded in persuading Willie Boy Johnson to testify against Gotti, but she still managed to keep the witness stand filled with a sordid procession of mob turncoats. But then it was Bruce Cutler's turn. Shoulders down, fists clenched, he lumbered toward the stand and began his attack. Gotti urged his lawyer on with delight. "Brucify him." First there was Edward Maloney. "You'd agree with me, sir, you are a menace and have always been, haven't you?" "No." "Were you a menace to society when you went into jewelry stores and held people up with a loaded gun?"
"Yes."
Maloney surrendering under Cutler's barrage. He was quivering by the time he slinked from the stand, and the jury was openly smirking at him. Cutler's verbal assault on Giacalone's next witness was a short, nasty piece of business, but no less effective. In no time at all, he was referring to Crazy Sally Polsey, a robber who used to hang out with the Bergen crew, as a yellow dog for participating in a prison race riot. His rapid-fire cross-examination was tenacious, and he soon had the ex-con staggering, agreeing that Gotti was loved and revered in the streets of Ozone Park, the same neighborhood where Yellow Dog Polsey peddled drugs. They kept going at Giacalone for the entire trial, and she, a scrapper, refused to yield. But her will seemed to collapse after Matthew Traynor took the stand. He was the defense's final witness, a smirking bank robber and drug dealer. Giacalone had once considered him as a prosecution witness. However, after catching him in a series of lies, she had no choice but to turn her back on him and on his prospects for a reduced sentence. Traynor portrayed himself as a disillusioned man. A mere mortal, he desperately wanted the jury to understand, who was more sinned against than sinning. He recounted his ruthless victimization at the hands of none other than Diane Giacalone. She fed him drugs and kept him zonked to win his cooperation.
I was so stoned I didn't want to go home.
And why was he so abused, so tortured? Traynor answered with tormented anger.
She wanted me to frame Mr. Gotti and the others.
Then, at last, it was mercifully over. After 7 months and 90 witnesses, on March 6, 1987, the case went to the jury. The verdict came a week later, on Friday the 13th. John Gotti and his co-defendants were acquitted on all charges. The announcement was made in open court by juror number 11, the ex-Marine who had been chosen as foreperson. As soon as he heard about the verdict, George Gabriel decided he had to see Gotti. He had made a promise to the Don in the trial's opening days, and now he felt it was very important to keep it. Gabriel's timing was perfect. His Ford pulled into 101st Street just as the gray Cadillac carrying John Gotti turned the corner. Gabriel jumped from his car, and Gotti approached full of cheer.
Agent Gabriel, how you doing?
Remember, John, I told you how I'd be all over you the day you got out? I always keep my promise. I'm going to be right on top of you from now on. But it was just a joke to Gotti.
It's a free country.
His boys enjoyed that one. Gotti waved goodbye and disappeared inside the Bergen. When he came out an hour later, Gabriel was still there. Hey, John, long time no see. The Don walked rigidly past him. The next morning, the entire C-16 squad was in Mao's office. Mao had started a new case file, number 183-35-07. It was a small, bureaucratic step, but he wanted to do something. It didn't help. He felt diminished by how empty the file was, by all that needed to be done. We're only going to get one chance, just one, so we're going to do it our way, by ourselves. However long it takes, we'll wait. It's our number one priority. We will get John Gotti. Bruce Mao also found himself considering a new mystery. He was not sure how, or if it fit into his pursuit of John Gotti. It was just something he told a few of his agents that bugged him. A bee in my bonnet. The city police, it seemed, had managed to plant a microphone in the head of a parking meter outside a Gambino social club on Myrtle Avenue in Brooklyn. The mic had only been up for a couple of days, however, before the operation hit an unanticipated snag. Louis Ha-Ha Atanasio, furious with a parking ticket on his caddy, had run back into the club only to emerge with a sledgehammer. His anger would not be satiated until he had pounded a parking meter to smithereens. The police report moaned that it was just bad luck that he had chosen to attack the one meter with the microphone in its head. But Mao could not find a record of any parking ticket given to a caddy belonging to a Louis Atanasio, and a quick drive by the club showed him that there was a long row of meters stretching along Myrtle Avenue. What were the odds, he wondered, that a vengeful Louis Ha-Ha would just happen to assault the lone doctored meter? Slim in a perfect world, and none, he told himself, in the real world. The incident became another entry in his mole file. Another mystery that, Mao realized with considerable dissatisfaction, he so far didn't have the slightest chance of solving. Part 3. Tickling the Wire. After John Gotti's courtroom victory, a series of triumphs began on many fronts. His most visible success was, undoubtedly, the least expected. He had become a folk hero of sorts. The press realized they had struck a journalistic motherlode, a real-life Don as compelling as any fictive godfather. Gotti appeared on the cover of Time, his portrait painted by none other than Andy Warhol. When he and his entourage of men with necks as thick as tire rims showed up at Regine's, his bodyguards had to hold off the groupies and the autograph seekers. Off-camera, Gotti was also active. He was determined to rid the Gambino organization of the old-fashioned Castellano way of doing business. When he had planned the Castellano hit, he had courted Joseph Gallo, the family's ancient white-haired consigliere. But now that he was Don, he did not want a competitive senior statesman in his administration. Gotti forced Gallo to resign his position as the number 3 man in the family. In his place, Gotti appointed the Iceman, Sammy Bull Gravano. That emphasized Gotti's commitment to young blood, and, equally important, it warned that Gotti was not just talking tough. It was well known in the streets that Gravano was a one-man murder machine. Gotti was just starting out to show what kind of family he was going to run. So when his new consigliere came to him with a beef about a crew member, Michael DeBatt, a former Wake Forest football star turned mobster, who was shooting too much heroin to be trusted, the Godfather issued his decree without hesitation. You have my permission to ice him. As John Gotti forged ahead, a dispirited Bruce Mao had to admit that his team was back at square one, searching for a point of attack. Mao, like Gotti himself, moved on many fronts. Mao focused once again on the possibility of a Gotti spy in law enforcement. To the list of clues in his closely held and growing mole file, he now added a new one. On one of the tapes that had been secretly recorded in the kitchen of Castellano's Staten Island home, a perplexed Tommy Bellotti had suddenly asked his boss a question. "What's superseded mean?" Dutifully, like a father helping a slow child, Big Paul struggled through an approximate definition, yet at the same time he also managed to drop a few hints that suggested the family was receiving advance warning of pending indictments in Manhattan. After an intense session in his office with Andy Kearns and Joe O'Brien, Mao came up with a plan to trap the culprit. A phony indictment charging Joe Butch Correo with loan sharking would be filed in the Southern District of Manhattan. The indictment, its progress carefully monitored by Kearns and O'Brien, worked its way uneventfully through the twists and turns of the judicial system until it reached the desk of Mildred Russo, a deputy court clerk in Manhattan. By all appearances, she was an unlikely conspirator. Granny was the dismissive one-word description that crossed O'Brien's mind as he flipped through a drawer of courthouse index cards while keeping a watchful eye on whomever was handling the bogus indictment. Yet to his amazement and mounting rage, he saw the petite gray-haired woman, with not the least hesitation or fuss, slip the indictment into her desk drawer. Moments later, she marched to the Xerox room at a distinctly military clip. That evening, Joe Butch Correo, without even pausing to pack a bag, took off for Florida on a chartered jet. He was fleeing at great expense and haste from an indictment that, except in the world of Mao's scheme, did not exist. It was not long, however, before Mildred Russo was removed from her job and was herself the target of a genuine indictment. Yet by the nature of her job, she was of limited value to the family. If she was out there, so Mao had to believe was someone else. There existed a mole who protected Gotti, and whom Gotti, when cornered, would depend upon. The main thrust of Mao's attention was to find a way to jumpstart his operation against John Gotti. He would pepper John Gotti's meeting places with bugs. Gotti would no doubt be careful, but, and this was the key to his strategy, Gotti had to talk. Gotti was, after all, the head of the Gambino crime family. The boss was running a multi-million-dollar business. The problem then was not would Gotti talk, but where. Mao soon discovered that now that Gotti was boss of bosses, he was stepping into the brighter lights and bigger promise of Manhattan. The Bergen, tucked away in the back-alley obscurity of Queens, was a suitable hangout when he was just a capo running a crew of wise guys, but his new main base of operations was Frank Della Croce's old club, the Ravenite in Little Italy. The Ravenite would be a difficult target not simply for the team to monitor, but also for the techies to penetrate. Maybe impossible. Part of the difficulty was the neighborhood. Little Italy was alive with a bustling army of plainclothes watchers. An exasperated police report crossed Mao's desk. The denizens of that area are very alert to the presence of strangers and strange vehicles. The fact that even law-abiding inhabitants of that area will report the presence of strangers to the organized crime figures who frequent it is legend in the NYPD. Also well known was the list of surveillances mounted against the club in Della Croce's day that had quickly turned sour. When the cops had tried to break into the club in the middle of the night to plant a microphone, they were rebuffed by a ferocious German shepherd. They returned the next night, planning to drug the dog, only to find a half-dozen baseball bat-wielding thugs waiting for them. Leading the charge was the club's elderly caretaker, Mike Sorelli, who lived with his wife in an apartment on the building's second floor. To make things worse, all these fiascos had occurred before the security-conscious Gotti took over the family. Now that the Ravenite was his headquarters, he had transformed the club into what appeared to be a fortress. Meanwhile, on weekends, the team discovered, Gotti, like any suburbanite weary from all the daily commuting, preferred to stay closer to home. He shifted his court back to the Bergen. But the Ravenite was the key, and they couldn't even figure out a way to get in. Then one night, a team of watchers, much to their annoyance, found themselves trapped inside the blue observation van that they already called the submarine. Someone had double-parked directly in front of the van and then vanished. They had, the agents realized, no choice but to sit tight and wait. And while they waited, they also watched. They were watching when the lights inside the club were shut off and, as was the practice, the last man out, Norman DuPont, locked the front door for the night. DuPont, in his late 20s, broad-shouldered, movie-star handsome, and a self-styled tough guy with an assault charge on his rap sheet against an off-duty cop to prove it, was a nephew of Mike Sorelli, Ravenite's elderly caretaker. During the day, DuPont worked for the sanitation department. At night, he worked as the club's bartender. He also was the one who showed up at 4 to unlock the front door, and he was always the last to leave. DuPont was probably the only garbage collector in the city who drove a gold Jaguar. Still, the agents didn't take him too seriously. But that night at around 10, DuPont returned to the club, and he was not alone. A woman was with him. The couple did not emerge from the club until just after 1 in the morning. They were holding hands. The following night, at around 10, DuPont returned to the club, and again a woman was with him. It was a different woman. She had black hair and was shapely like the woman the night before, but she was years younger and really special, alive, lots of bouncing flesh, and very sexy. The next Monday, DuPont was back to his old tricks. Only now there was a third woman with him, a redhead, the punkish color clearly out of a bottle, and not as pretty as the other two. Kearns was a bit impressed by the audacity of it all. Talk about unsafe sex! All along, Mao had been preaching, find the weak link, and now, like an answered prayer, they had found it. There were only 4 possible accomplices, and methodically the team focused on each one in some detail. DuPont might just be foolish enough to think he would be better off taking his chances with the Godfather than with the FBI. The garish redhead was a junkie, and her allegiances and her promises would be sworn on some very shaky ground, so both of them were out. Gotti, too, moved down a list. He was spending a good deal of his time shoring up the weak links in his family. Sammy Gravano, his new consigliere, came to him with a beef that Louis Melito was bad-mouthing the administration. You could never tell where all that loose talk would lead. The Godfather agreed that they had better take him out. The woman the watchers had spotted with DuPont on the first night turned out to be connected. Her father was a made guy, and her mother's brother, her favorite uncle, was a capo. They would be asking her to betray not just DuPont or even Gotti, but the entire world she was raised in. But as soon as the background check was completed on the remaining woman on their list, the looker they had admiringly dubbed her, there was a general agreement that their search was over. She was young, just 23, and that, to the team's manipulative way of looking at things, made her easily compliant. She was Hispanic, so there were certainly no family members lurking in her closet. And, the clincher, she was a clerk for the Internal Revenue Service on Church Street in Lower Manhattan. She already worked for the government. She may have been swayed by George Gabriel, who was tall and handsome, and when he tried to be, a charmer, or by the attention of Bruce Mao, or intrigued by the prospect of doing undercover work for the FBI, or simply eager to do in DuPont, whom she was quick to call a bastard. The possibility of getting a significant promotion as well as a raise, both were offered, might very well have played a part in bringing her around. Whatever her motivation, she provided a sketch of the layout, and second, and this was pure gold, she, as Mao watched open-mouthed, had drawn in the precise location of the table in the back room where she insisted John Gotti always sat. "Norman always made a point about it. We always make love lying across that table. I think it turns Norman on. You know, screwing on the Godfather's table." She also had drawn in a back door to the club, opening onto a hallway that was shared with the rest of the tenement building and secured with just a bolt up by the top. Norman was always checking it, making sure it was in place before he left each night. Said they'd kill him if he ever forgot. Mao now had a source inside the Ravenite. The time had come to spike John Gotti's headquarters. John Kravick, the tech team supervisor, had planned it all to go down like this. At some time after 1 in the morning, a city garbage truck will pull up quite routinely to 247 Mulberry Street. In all that clanging commotion, why should anyone notice that a tall Sub-Zero refrigerator box is brought from the truck to the sidewalk? Meanwhile, inside the box, your hero, John Kravick, it was his habit to talk about himself in the third person, will be slow counting to 500. He will peel off the tape that is holding the makeshift back of the refrigerator box in place, and, presto, find himself an arm's length from the tenement's front door. Kravick had become a master at picking the very make of lock that secured the tenement door. With the front door open, Kravick, now joined by 2 of his ablest wiremen who have hurried from a bureau car, will saunter down the hallway, make a right, and lo and behold, there's the back door to the Ravenite. And, neatest trick of all, the door will be unlocked. The looker, after a spirited session across Gotti's table with Norman DuPont, would linger in the rear room just long enough to throw the bolt. But it hadn't worked out that way. Something was outside the box. Kravick suddenly realized with disgust that a stray dog was pissing on his hiding place. So much for counting to 500. He moved the plan forward immediately, and without further incident, he found himself standing in the headquarters of John Gotti and the Gambino crime family. He had to find an appropriately unobtrusive place to hide a microphone that was not much larger than the eraser on a number 2 pencil, then run a line from the mic into the existing power, and finally camouflage all the chipped paint, scraped walls, and often yards of hair-thin wire involved in the process. He aimed his flashlight beam along the floor, using Gotti's table as his starting point. The light was making its way toward the rear door when he discovered a rectangular metal grill just above the baseboard. It was a heating duct, he realized. He moved in closer with the mini-mag and saw that the grill was held into the wall by a screw in each corner. He looked over to his men. "Help me unscrew this thing." They worked with surprising speed, yet carefully. Meanwhile, Kravick decided on a miniature mic and, using just his thumb and index finger, inserted it into the screw hole in the grill's upper right-hand corner. After a dollop of beeswax from his caulking syringe and a dab of paint, no one would ever notice. He gave his team a thumbs up. Without further comment, Kravick was on his hands and knees shaking number 38-gauge wire, about as thick as a strand of hair, down the back of the grill and along the interior of the wall above the heating duct. The wire reached an electrical outlet. He twisted it about the proper terminals and then soldered the connection. It took only seconds to screw the outlet cover back over the socket. When the grill was replaced and the brownish paint was drying, Kravick scooped up a ball of dust from the corner of the floor and spread it around the mic and the genuine screws. They were up inside the Ravenite, and Mao could not wait to get to work each morning. He was consumed by listening to each new tape. When he heard a door slam or the booming echo of footfalls as a gopher made his way into the back room of the club, in his mind's eye he would sketch in the details of each scene, even the way Gotti aimed a single .38 caliber finger to order an espresso. Mao was fascinated. And yet he had to acknowledge that operationally the tapes were a colossal disappointment. When the building's ancient heating system coughed and wheezed into action, it was almost as if the mic in the heating duct was at ground zero. You had better remove those headphones quick or you might never hear again. And when the transcribers in the windowless audio room on Queens Boulevard were not wearily writing IA for inaudible, they found themselves writing UM, unknown male. That was the other frustrating problem. When things were jumping, the club would be jammed with 50, maybe 60 rapidly talking tough guys. But even when a conversation came across loud and clear, Even when the identities of the participants were apparent, the transcripts still were of little intelligence value. Not an incriminating word was ever heard. Mao sent Kravick into the back room of the Bergen, reasoning that perhaps Gotti would be more loose-lipped on the weekends. Spiking this club was a snap, yet it too caught little that would interest a court of law. George Gabriel was in Kravick's office when the call came. It was a hot July afternoon, nearly 5 weeks after the tech team had spiked the Bergen. "We're blown." Gotti had found the bug that had been hidden in the Bergen, and on Monday afternoon, when the Ravenite heating duct mic was scheduled to go up again, Mao found that the mic was alive, but it didn't matter. After the discovery at the Bergen, the Don was not going to take any chances. From now on, every conversation inside the Ravenite would be drowned out in a cascading sea of white noise. There was one more blow. It had little operational effect on the case. On a purely emotional level, it was the most painful. On August 29, 1988, at 7 in the morning, Willie Boy Johnson was on his way to his car. It had been almost 2 years after his betrayal of the family had first been revealed. 4 men formed a circle around Willie Boy and opened fire, and they kept on shooting. The coroner found 19 bullet holes in Willie Boy Johnson's body. Gotti gave a wistful shrug hours later to a reporter.
"Well, we all gotta go sometime."
It was a very rough stretch for Mao and his team, and there was no reason to believe things were going to get any better. While Bruce Mao was still trying to figure out what to do next, the Manhattan District Attorney arrested John Gotti for assault. If Gotti were convicted and sentenced to 25 years as a predicate felon, all of the Gambino squad's costly efforts over the past 3 years would have been wasted. The DA's charges were revealed at a standing-room-only press conference. In February 1986, John O'Connor, the vice president and business manager of the Carpenters Union, had appeared at a restaurant that was under construction by a non-union crew. The owners of the Bankers and Brokers restaurant were worldly men. They offered O'Connor $5,000 to solve this problem. It wasn't enough. Before the week was out, a team of crowbar-wielding thugs trashed the place. The restaurant, however, had a silent partner, the Gambino family. When Angelo Ruggiero reported the incident to the new Don, Gotti didn't remain silent for long.
"Bust him up. Put a rocket in his pocket."
That incendiary command to Fat Ange Ruggiero was overheard by the State Organized Crime Task Force bug at the Bergen. In May, O'Connor was cornered by 4 gunmen. They weren't out to kill him, only to make a point. He was shot in the buttocks and both legs. After a month spent recuperating in the hospital, O'Connor told police that he had been waylaid by Puerto Rican gunmen. The DA's office, however, was certain it could convince a jury, and they decided to bring it to trial. Not that the prosecutors weren't wary. Robert Morgenthau, the Manhattan District Attorney, extracted a promise that the FBI would be on the lookout for jury tampering. Despite either the evidence or the institutional forces that were being lined up against him, John Gotti was full of his usual take-your-best-shot cockiness.
3-to-1 odds I beat this case.
The long winter of 1989 seemed to be a ceasefire for Bruce Mao, but he had not given up. He now realized he had spiked the wrong locations. He had no doubt that Gotti was meeting somewhere with the Gambino administration to run the family. He just needed to find out where those secret meetings were held. First, there was a December 1988 209 report from Frankie, Kern's longtime TE. Frankie reported that now that it was winter, Gotti was reluctant to go for walk talks along Mulberry Street. Instead, he and his administration huddled in the hallway outside the club. So Mao went back to the Ravenite tapes, and there it was, Gotti at his table whispering to Sammy Bull, then the sound of a chair scraping against the floor, the pounding of footsteps, and a high-pitched whine as a door swung open and a cannon blast as it slammed shut. It was a stage direction that had been omitted on dozens of the transcripts, but without it the drama was incomplete. Exit stage left. The back door to the club led to the isolated hallway where Gotti and his men secretly discussed family business. But Mao did not stop there. He was still restless when he finished, so in a logical progression he reached for Norman DuPont's file. There was Gotti, at the funeral of the Ravenites' caretaker, Mike Sorelli, making a point to tell DuPont to change the locks on Sorelli's upstairs apartment. Again, Mao searched the 209s. One of the twins' TEs had reported that he heard a rumor that Gotti had a place, maybe an apartment, where he conducted important meetings. It was in Little Italy, he thought. Mao now knew where Gotti held his most secret meetings. The summer of 1989 was a period of intense activity as the C-16 team swung back into action. They would return to the Ravenite, although this time Jim Kravick promised he had a few tricks up his sleeve to improve audibility. They would also spike the hallway and, somehow, the Sorelli apartment. And there was one more impossible mission. If Kravick could come up with a feasible plan, they would monitor the walk-talks along Mulberry Street. Mike Sorelli's 78-year-old widow, Lena, still lived in the two-room apartment. George Gabriel found that she hardly ever left the apartment. She even usually had someone do the shopping for her, and that someone was the looker. At the tail end of September, Kravick's tech squad had gone back into the rear room of the Ravenite. Kravick had hardwired the mic into the phone lines rather than into the electrical current, and the sound that now traveled from the club was pure. For the agents in the plant, it was quite literally like listening in on an extension phone. Next, in the middle of October, Kravick returned to the building to spike the hallway. Each day, the C-16 agents typed out summaries of what they had overheard the night before about the LCN, La Cosa Nostra, and even in those brief reports, they could hardly restrain their excitement. SDNY 1988, Ravenite Hallway, October 27, 1989. Time, 6:48 p.m. John Gotti and John Gambino discuss a murder apparently involving Tommy Patera, a Bonanno LCN soldier. It also appears that Gotti and Gambino are discussing a bid-rigging job. November 7, 1989. Time, approximate 7:24 p.m. Gotti states, "These tapes, the fucking tapes, they're gonna get everybody and anybody. The fucking rat cops and prosecutors." Gotti appears concerned that tapes of electronic surveillance of him and others will put them in jail. Scattered throughout these reels of tapes were small hints that reinforced the speculative theory that the Sorelli apartment was vital. With Lena Sorelli spending the Thanksgiving holiday with her sister on Staten Island, Kravick and his team were in the apartment without incident. Kravick decided to place the bug in Sorelli's VCR. He was willing to gamble that Gotti and his guys didn't come up from the club to watch old movies. It did not take him long to remove one of the screws that held the black metal frame of Mrs. Sorelli's VCR together, insert his mic in its place, and then splice the two wires that ran out of the mic into the electric cord that was plugged into the wall socket. Apartment 10 was now wired for sound. The mic in Apartment 10 went up for the first time at 4:35 that afternoon. Carol Kazmarek was the plant manager that night. She left the summary report in the black combination safe in Mao's office. SDNY 2005, Apartment 10, November 22, 1989. No principals at location. No pertinent conversations. Mao took it in stride. He spoke to Gabriel with reassuring logic. "You can't expect Gotti to use the apartment every night. We've waited this long. We can wait a little longer." But these terse summary reports began to pile up day after day, and both Mao and Gabriel grew increasingly on edge. On the evening of November 30, 1989, one of the monitoring agents called to Kazmarek at that moment from across the room. "Carol, we might have something here." She listened to the sound of a door slowly wheezing open. Next, a drum roll of footsteps.
"I think this is the perfect moment for you to treat yourself with a little kindness. Here is a soothing track to heal the soul. Let all your worries drift away, keeping only peace and lightness in every breath before we return."
John Gotti's booming and familiar voice was coming in loud and wonderfully clear.
"She ain't home yet,"
Sammy Bull corrected him.
"Yeah, she is." "She is home? Oh, good. Don't forget to ask me for the money to give it to her."
Kaczmarek listened intently as the head of the Gambino family and his consigliere made arrangements to pay the woman whose apartment they were borrowing for their meeting, Mrs. Sorelli. Then the door opened again, and Gotti's voice offered a soft and curiously mournful greeting.
"Mike." "Yeah, John. First, we're sorry." "Thank you. I don't have to tell you how sorry we are, Mike."
Michael Quarro, an attorney, had good reason to be upset. That afternoon he had been convicted in a federal court in Brooklyn of RICO charges tied to the Gambino family's heroin trafficking operations. He was facing a decade or more in jail. Carol Kaczmarek took off the headphones and punched a button on the speed dial phone. Bruce Mao picked up the receiver in his cottage near Oyster Bay.
"It's the apartment. We're up, loud and clear, and Gotti has a guest, Mike Quarro."
"I'm on my way in." The November 30 conversation, Apartment 10, tape number 1, as it came to be known in the case files, was a treasure trove. They heard the Don launch into a complaint about how all the family troubles started after the FBI bugged Angelo Ruggiero's house.
"You know how they invade your privacy? You hear a baby crying, your wife crying. You say, 'It could be my house, my baby, my wife. Where the fuck are we going?' Maybe you want to throw a fart in the bathroom. You hear it in open court. They hear you farting like that poor fucking Frank the Wop. His phone was in the bathroom. He's taking a shit and he's talking. That's a fucking shame." Then he goes, "Bing!" He said, "Hey, I feel better now. I couldn't move."
That cracked up Sammy Bull. The Iceman couldn't stop laughing, and by now the team in the plant was laughing too. Later in the evening, the Godfather once again turned to the intrusiveness of all the FBI's bugging operations. He lectured his consigliere.
"You gotta relax in your fucking house, the way we're relaxing right here."
That didn't cause any laughter to break out in the plant, but the irony didn't escape anyone either. After just a cursory listen to that first apartment tape, George Gabriel began sketching a preliminary indictment in his mind. At the very least, he was convinced they could make a RICO case against Gotti and his men for operating a criminal enterprise, and perhaps even for obstruction of justice in the Castellano murder investigation. Mao wasn't satisfied. He relentlessly combed the transcript for clues he could use in his long, solitary struggle. Continuing his search for the mole, he awaited Gotti's return to Apartment 10. But once again, the Don took Mao by surprise. He did not return to the Sorelli apartment for nearly 2 weeks. Finally, Gotti did return. At 7:13 on the evening of December 12, the Don sat down with his acting underboss, Frankie Locascio, in the living room of Apartment 10, and the mic in the VCR picked up every word. Gotti was in a tense, irritable state that evening. It was Sammy Bull who had initially sparked the Godfather's irritation. The Iceman, Gotti was coming around to realize, had green eyes. All he saw was money. Gotti ranted plaintively to Frankie Locke about the Bull's growing business empire.
"Where the fuck are we going here? Every fucking time I turn around, there's a new company popping up. Building, consulting, concrete, and every time we got a partner that don't agree with us, we kill him. What do I get out of this here?"
Locasio's conciliatory reply was terse and nearly inaudible, but it didn't matter what the underboss said. Gotti was steaming.
"I say, Sammy, slow it down, slow it down. You come up with 15 companies, for Christ's sake. You got concrete pouring, you got tiled floor now, you got construction, you got drywall, you got asbestos, you got rugs. What the fuck next?" The other day, Sammy says, "And I got the paint, and I got—"
Gotti mimicked his own incredulous reaction.
"You got a paint company?" I told him. He said, "Well, 6 weeks ago we started a paint company. Don't you remember I told you?" "I don't fucking remember you told me. What am I, fucking nuts? Now you got me thinking I'm fucking nuts. When did you tell me you got a paint company? When I was looking over there?"
Gotti sighed, and then, without the least bit of irony, complained bitterly.
4 fucking years. I got no companies."
What made Gravano's greed so intolerable to Gotti and his own victimization so complete was the Bull's ingratitude, especially since Gotti had killed anyone who got in the Iceman's way.
"When DeBee got whacked, they told me a story. I was in jail when I whacked him. I knew why it was being done. I'd done it anyway."
Gotti had done it for the same reason Gravano had used to convince him to murder Louis Molito.
Frankie, you told me the guy talked behind my back. Did the bee ever talk subversive to you?
Never, Johnny.
I took Sammy's word that he talked about me behind my back. Did Louis ever talk to any of you guys?
Locassio's response was immediate.
No.
Gotti made another put-upon sigh.
I took Sammy's word.
He now understood he was being played for a fool. He had Robert DiBernardo and Louis Molito murdered simply because Sammy Bull complained about their disrespectful behavior, and now both DeBee's lucrative construction company and Molito's Gem Steel were controlled by the Iceman. Still, Gotti did not want his underboss to get the impression he was completely subservient to Gravano's machinations. He was planning to kill the Bull's old nemesis, Louis de Bono, not simply because the man was a business partner of Gravano's. Gotti's grudge was more immediate.
You know why he's dying? He's going to die because he refused to come in when I called. He didn't do nothing else wrong.
As he wound down, Gotti's rage left him drained. He was in a melancholy mood, woeful and self-effacing.
I don't want nothing. I would be a billionaire if I was looking to be a selfish boss. All I want is a good sandwich. You see this sandwich here, this tuna sandwich? That's all I want, a good sandwich.
In his tirade, he had destroyed himself. C-16's official summary of the sit-down made its way quickly to Washington. Report. This lengthy conversation intercepted between Gotti and Locassio lasted for approximately 1 hour, during which Gotti and Locassio discussed a variety of topics, to include the structure of the Gambino family chain of command and protocol within the ranks, murder and murder conspiracy, labor racketeering in the construction industry, interaction between LCN families, control of labor unions, and control of the carting industry. In the halls of justice it could not have been greeted with more delight. But Mao understood that an arrest, an indictment even, was not a conviction. Gotti had vividly proved that. He was the master of escape. He knew Gotti would win again unless he caught the mole. The selection of new members was only one of the tasks on John Gotti's list when he convened the sit-down with Frankie Locassio, Sammy Gravano, and others in the living room of Apartment 10 on the evening of January 4. The assault trial was only weeks away, but it wasn't the outcome that concerned him. He knew the state had recorded him in the Bergen ordering Fat Ange to put a rocket in John O'Connor's pocket. But he had a plan. What was weighing on him, however, was the possibility that if the information the grim reaper George Helbig had provided was accurate, they might indict him for the Castellano murder and deny him bail in that case. Trying to run things from a cell affected business. Some people even began to get big ideas. So that was why he thought it was important to put a little list together. Inducting new members into the family would, Gotti hoped, send a message. It was business as usual.
Frank, I just didn't want to make it look like we're nuts. All the heat going on trial, that we don't give a fuck. Hey, we just got the list out. You know what I'm trying to say?
Gotti wasn't at all persuaded that the guileless, white-haired Locassio could handle things if his boss went to jail, so he deposed Frankie Locke without apology and chose instead Sammy Gravano.
This is my wishes, that if I'm in a fucking can, this family is going to be run by Sammy. I'm still the boss. If I get 50 years, I know what I got to do. But when I'm in the can, Sammy's in charge.
All his previous complaints about Sammy's green eyes, all his wild anger over how Sammy had manipulated him, were forgotten, at least temporarily. Gotti had few doubts about putting Gravano, a man he was just coming to know, in the number 2 position. He told his new underboss that he needed an Iceman.
Just the fact that you're out there, that you could sneak out in the middle of the night and hit a guy in the fucking head with a hatchet. You follow? Understand, Sammy?
He did, of course. On the evening of January 17, as John Gotti's trial moved into its second week, Mao received a call from the observation post. A walk-talk was in progress with Sammy Bull Gravano and Joe Butch Correo, and tagging right along was the lumbering figure of George Helbig in the freezing cold. Mao was certain Helbig, the leg man, was delivering the latest report from the mole, and he hoped to capture it with the microphones in the parked federal vehicles. But Deep Street, C-16's newest audio surveillance, was a failure, for that night at least. Trapped behind a row of double-parked cars, the microphones could not pick up a word. The mole had escaped. But just when Mao had given up all hope, a call came later that night from the plant. Gotti, still free on bail, and his administration had met in apartment 10, and they had company: Joe Butch Correo and George Helbig. The tape that Mao played the next morning for his inner circle left no doubts. Helbig, the Grim Reaper, as Gotti bitterly called him, made his report. Sammy Bull's construction office and club were bugged. As of January 1, the State Organized Crime Task Force was running the show. Gotti sighed like a wounded animal.
This I can't believe. The state? Jesus, motherfucking Christ. Tell him, Georgie, you could do me a favor. Just tell him, give me a little specifics. Even if he got to get a few dollars, we'll give him a few. He could tell you the hour that, if he's that much in the investigation. He could tell you the hour, Georgie. We will appreciate it.
The next morning, Mao played the entire tape to his men. We're going to find that traitor, and once we do, we're going to nail both him and Gotti to the wall, for good. There were 2 checks. One was from the insurance company of the driver of the van that had smashed into him that rainy afternoon on the Manhattan Bridge. It was for $145,000. The other was from the City of New York and its insurance company, Aetna Casualty and Surety Company. It was for $1,600,000. William Peist received the checks in February 1990. It was more than 5 years since the accident that had left him after 3 separate operations with his left leg amputated up to his thigh. The department had turned on him. The board rejected his petition for a tax-free line-of-duty pension. The department, however, had allowed him to return. He was a Gold Shield detective assigned to the intelligence unit. His expertise was in organized crime, and he was, as they say in intelligence circles, cleared for the world. He was aware of nearly all of law enforcement's ongoing operations against the mob. He worked with prosecutors, the state task force, and the FBI. The week he received the 2 checks that made him a millionaire, he was working special duty. Detective Peist's job was to protect the jurors from the associates of the man standing trial. The defendant was John Gotti. Part 4. Nailing Them to the Wall. John Gotti had done the impossible. His 3rd courtroom victory in a row. When after 3 days of deliberation the jury foreman had read the not guilty verdict that afternoon on the assault charges, he might as well have been announcing that the Teflon Don was beyond the law. After the Grim Reaper tape, the C-16 squad had begun to understand how completely their final charge on Gotti would have to be a solitary attack. The Bureau kept the existence of a high-level traitor a secret from all other law enforcement agencies. And the Bureau, despite the assurances to Manhattan DA Robert Morgenthau that it would alert his office to any evidence of possible jury tampering during the Gotti trial, had decided this commitment, too, was no longer binding. C-16 had the proof the DA wanted, but they refused to share it. On the January 17 apartment tape, the same tape that confirmed Mao's suspicions about the mole, Gotti made another revelation.
We got one guy who's on the jury. His name's Hoyle or something. He lives here in Gramercy. Works like the Lower West Side. Maybe we can reach him.
This secret would be kept as tightly as the team had protected its knowledge of the bribe to the jury foreman 3 years ago. As the group of sullen agents had filed out of his office after hearing the January 17th tape for the first time, Mao motioned for Andy Kearns to stay. You got the ticket. There were no further instructions because none were necessary. Kearns knew what was at stake. I'll find the bastard. Kearns spent the next 4 days in the squad's audio room trying to pull out the few telltale times when the men in the apartment let slip, however indirectly, a clue to the traitor's identity. He shared his findings with Mao. There were 4 clues, and he ticked them off on the fingers of his right hand. Golfer, lawyer, cop, and cousin. Each of the 4 had appeared in Gotti's own words. That night in apartment 10, Gotti had urged Helbig to reach out to the traitor right away. Gotti spoke with a confiding, conspiratorial rumble to his words.
You tell him, be here. It'll help to buy a set of golf clubs or something.
That was the golfer. The Don, as the conversation in apartment 10 that night took another turn, was suddenly flat-out begging.
If he's that much in the investigation, he could tell you the hour, Georgie. Every cop he knows there. But that's good. You know why? He's a legitimate lawyer, so it's beautiful.
That, Kearns decided, could mean Gotti had a prosecutor on his payroll. The Don had been in a foul temper after Helbig and Joe Butch had left the apartment that night. He started complaining to Frankie Locke and Sammy Bull about both the Grim Reaper and the Capo. He didn't like them, and he didn't like their friends or even their relatives.
You know the fucking amazing thing about it? They all got a motherfucking cop that's a first cousin or an uncle or a fucking nephew.
Was Gotti referring to the mole, Kearns wondered? It made sense. It could be a cop. As soon as Helbig and Joe Butch left the apartment that night, Sammy Bull had spoken to his boss.
See, John, I know this guy you're talking about, Pete.
Yeah, that's his first cousin. This exchange confused Kearns no matter how many times he replayed it. Was Gotti saying the mole was the first cousin? And if so, whose? Was he Helbig's cousin, or perhaps Pete's? But then who was Pete? All Kearns knew for sure was that before George Helbig left apartment 10 on January 17th, he had made a promise to his boss.
I'll send a message.
Kearns decided he might as well start finding out all he could about Big George. He could only hope it would bring him closer to learning who had received Big George's message. Golfer? Lawyer? Cop? Or cousin? George Helbig had his hooks in all over the place. Helbig had a German father, so he wasn't made and never would be. Yet he certainly got around. There was a disco in New Jersey, Cloud 9, that had already attracted the IRS's attention. Another club out on Long Island, Plaza Disco, something called J&G Realty, as well as Tri-State Petroleum, a Brooklyn fuel company that was a genuine moneymaker and legit to boot. And Helbig also controlled several food concessions near the boardwalk in Coney Island. Kearns decided to put the string of companies under close scrutiny. There was always the chance the mole worked with Helbig, or was a silent partner, as they were sure Joe Butch Correo, the Gambino capo, was. Steve Eichen answered the door himself, and as soon as he saw the badge and heard the word subpoena, he seemed to Kearns' eyes to go pale.
Mind if we talk outside? No point in getting my wife upset.
No problem. Eichen had been a cop for 3 years, but when Internal Affairs began an investigation into his off-duty activities, he decided to resign. Now he was working as a private investigator, mostly digging up dirt for mob lawyers. He also was a good friend of Joe Butch Correo. It was the capo who had brought him along to play poker with John Gotti. I hear you're a friend of John Gotti.
No, not really.
No?
Well, yeah, sure I know him, but it's PI work. I'm doing some stuff for one of his lawyers, for Barry Slotnick. It's no big deal. I'm just trying to make a living.
I see.
Look, I want to cooperate.
Good.
So tell me how I can help. I mean, what's this all about?
Kearns tried to look very grim. It's about Cloud 9.
Hey, I lost money in that. It was a business deal. Nothing wrong with that, right?
Kearns said that his interest was actually not so much in the discotheque, but in money that apparently had been funneled from Cloud 9 into J&G Realty. Eichen was incredulous.
You're jamming me up over J&G?
Look, it's no big deal. No one's saying you did anything illegal.
Good, 'cause I didn't.
But you want to help, right?
Sure, but I got nothing to do with J&G. I got involved in Cloud 9 because of Georgie and Pete.
Kearns kept silent and prayed Eichen would continue. In a moment he did.
They're friends from the old neighborhood. We grew up together. I've known Georgie Helbig and Pete Mavis since we was kids.
Kearns reassured Eichen. Like I said, it's no big deal. He was suddenly in a hurry to leave. As soon as he was in his car, Kearns turned to a new page in his notebook and wrote in big block letters at the top, Pete Mavis. Below that he wrote, Pete's cousin? A check through the state and corporation files for the location of J&G Realty brought Kearns to a brick two-family walk-up. It turned out to be the home of Pete and Ann Mavis. Now that Kearns had an address to go with the name, he subpoenaed the phone company's records for the last 6 months so he could learn whom Pete called. And a check of the license plate numbers of the cars that pulled into Tri-State Petroleum's garage led to another phone list. There was a car owned by a woman whose name had also appeared in the J&G Realty file. She had been receiving checks monthly from J&G. When interviewed, she informed the agent that the checks were alimony from her husband, which had suddenly stopped about 6 months ago. She was living off her job answering the phones at Tri-State. In exchange for a promise to try and track down her husband, she provided Kearns a list of 10 names, and opposite each name was the telephone number of a beeper. Kearns stood in front of the phone booth and tried to figure out what to do next. According to the toll records, Helbig's personal beeper had been called dozens of times from this number in Brooklyn. Kearns groaned to himself. Perhaps whoever was calling Helbig's beeper lived in the neighborhood, parked here, where it was easy to find a space, used the phone, then walked to one of the apartment buildings along Cropsey Avenue. It was worth a try, he decided. He started up the block to the nearest building. The super was Hispanic and impressed by Kearns' credentials.
Well, Mr. FBI, how can I help?
Kearns showed the super photographs of George Helbig and Peter Mavis. Ever see these men around here? The super's face lit up.
5C, now I get it. You checking out the parties, right?
According to the super, nobody really lived in the apartment. It was just a party pad.
You should see the senoritas coming in and out.
When Kearns checked with the rental agents, he was told the apartment was rented by the J&G Realty Corporation. He also found out there was a phone in apartment 5C. It was registered to Peter Mavis. He immediately pulled the call records. The most frequently dialed number was registered to George Helbig in Colonial, New Jersey, but there were also a lot of calls to a number registered to a Constance Peist. Kearns, pursuing one more long shot, had decided to interview Peter Mavis's in-laws. It didn't take Kearns long to decide this was another dead end. He was trading small talk with the woman when something occurred to him. "You wouldn't happen to know a Constance Peist, would you?"
Oh, yes, that's Pete's cousin.
Perhaps it was the look Kearns gave her that made her continue.
Maybe you know her husband, Billy?
Kearns lied. "Billy Peist sounds familiar." She put the dishes in the sink.
I knew you would. He's a detective.
"Oh, that Billy Peist."
That's right, the one who works downtown in intelligence.
Kearns handed Mao a 3x5 index card. As soon as Kearns left the house in Staten Island, he had taken the blank card from his coat pocket and written a name across it, Detective William Peist. "You know this guy?" Mao studied the card for a moment. "Sure, he works OC for the Intel Squad, always calling me up, asking things." "Well, I hope you didn't tell him anything." Mao looked warily at Kearns. He did not like where this was going at all. "Because he's the mole, Bruce. I'm sure of it." Now that he had a name to go with Gotti's shorthand description, Kearns set out to learn all he could about William Peist. Born and raised in Brooklyn, William Peist had entered the Waldorf Astoria's 2-year training course for apprentice chefs. The Waldorf offered him a position as a banquet chef after graduation, and Peist took it. Then in September 1974, Peist decided to become a cop. He was laid off 9 months later, a victim of the city budget crisis. He found work instead as a chef for the corrections department. By 1979, Peist was rehired by the police department, and in 1983, after 2 years in the Public Morals Division, he was awarded his detective shield. December 3, 1984, was the date of the accident on the rain-slicked Manhattan Bridge. The loss of his left leg followed, and his $75 million lawsuits against the city. A tax-free line-of-duty pension was denied by the police department. The detective returned to the job, now assigned to the Intelligence Division. Peist's specialty, organized crime. On January 17, 1990, Detective William Peist had signed out to go to the Brooklyn DA's office. That night at the Ravenite, it was whispered to Gotti that Gravano's trailer and club had been bugged by wiremen working for the Brooklyn DA. Also on that evening was Helbig's promise to Gotti. "I'll send a message tonight." According to the phone records Kearns had subpoenaed, At 8:10 p.m. on January 17, 1990, Peter Mavis had called 718-375-0897. The number was registered to William Peist. When Kearns had finished his report, Mao considered the mystery he had lived for so long. It had tormented him, goaded him, and now at last he had discovered his formidable adversary, a one-legged cop called the Baker. "We've found our mole. Now we have to make a case." The Internal Affairs captain led Peist to an interrogation room.
"You're being placed on restricted duty."
Peist denied ever discussing confidential police department business with his cousin, Peter Mavis. He said he had never heard of a George Helbig, and he insisted he had never met or spoken to John Gotti. He would not confess. On June 22, 1990, after more than 500 hours of tapes had been recorded in the Ravenite and the hallway outside the club, after 6 remarkable conversations in apartment number 10, after Deep Street had been fully operational for a productive month, Mao announced to his squad that the time had come to shut down all the audio surveillances. "Enough is enough. Let's make our case." It was Mao's hope that the Justice Department would authorize him to arrest Gotti within the next 2 weeks. Mao was wrong. The days stretched on endlessly. Each one followed, he would soon say, by sleepless nights. After months of political infighting over who would present the case, finally the order was sent to Bruce Mao to get ready to make his arrests as soon as the Eastern District Grand Jury voted its indictments. It was high time, Mao thought. More than 6 months had passed since he ended his operation. Gotti had murdered 2 more men, and hints about the tapes were appearing in the newspapers. Most of the squad had gathered in Mao's office. When at last Mao spoke, he was smiling. "Wear your suits tomorrow, guys. We're taking them down." Mao was counting on surprise. If one of them got feisty or Gotti gave a signal, anything might happen. It could be a real firefight. But in the end, he decided to stick with just his squad. He shared his plan with his men that next morning. Tuesday, December 11, 1990. C-16 would assemble at headquarters in Lower Manhattan at 3:30. By 4, they would be in a half-dozen unmarked cars cruising around Little Italy. As soon as the observation post announced that Gotti, Gravano, and Locascio, the Gambino administration, were in the Ravenite, they would charge in and arrest them. They would go quietly. Or not, he conceded. It's anybody's guess. As he dismissed the squad, he yelled one last thought at his men. "Wear your vests!" At 3:30, George Gabriel was still in downtown Brooklyn. Mao had sent him and Mark Roberts to pick up search warrants. As long as C-16 was hitting the Ravenite, they might as well try to grab an address book or maybe a list of beeper numbers. Only things were dragging on. The way things were going, Gabriel realized he could miss the arrest. By 4 o'clock, Mao was in his car cruising along Houston Street when the observation post came in loud and clear over the walkie-talkie. "Number 2 is in." That meant Frankie Locke had entered the club. Mao reported back. "Read you. Nobody goes in until I give the order to take 'em." 5 o'clock, and Gabriel and Roberts were still pacing around the Brooklyn courthouse. At 6, the observation post reported again. "Number 3 is in." Gravano. "Remember, nobody goes in until I give the order." It must have been 6:30 when Gabriel finally had the warrants in his hand and, along with Roberts, was running to their car. He was driving along Mulberry Street, siren off, when at 6:52 the observation post made its final report. "Number 1 is here." As soon as he heard that, Gabriel looked to Roberts and stepped on the gas. Perfect timing. He sped down the block, pulled the car up on the curb, and burst into the Ravenite with his gun drawn. Roberts followed. Gabriel yelled to the room full of hoods. "FBI! Everyone just stay calm. We're here to arrest certain people." No one had moved or said a word, and it was 2 men against 30. Gabriel went up to Gotti. "John, you can tell the men to cooperate, or we can do it the hard way."
"How you doing, Agent Gabriel?"
"Don't fuck with me, John. We're taking you and Frankie Locke and Sammy in." Gotti looked around. "We?" At that moment, the rest of the C-16 team burst through the door. Gotti looked at the shotgun-carrying agents, and then at his men.
"It's no big deal. Just do what they tell you."
The agents led the hoods into the street. The plan was to isolate Gotti, Locascio, and Gravano in different corners of the club until the drive to headquarters for booking. Gotti, however, returned to his seat.
Hey, I got time to finish my coffee, right?
Mao walked up to him.
Things go the way I figure, that's about all you'll be doing for the rest of your life.
Frank Sparrow understood the mentality.
You don't have to act like a tough guy around these people. They've been brought up around tough guys all their life. You show them respect, and they respect that.
So when he and his partner, Matty Tricorico, drove Sammy Bull that evening from the club to 26 Federal Plaza for booking and fingerprinting, they didn't come on like two hard cases. Besides, Sammy was from Staten Island. He had known the twins from way back. What was the point of rubbing things in?
You want us to call Debbie for you? We can call her for you.
Frank was talking about Sammy's wife. He was approaching him with some respect. Just before they led him out of the car, while they were still in the garage beneath headquarters, Sparrow turned to Gravano.
Sammy, hey, you ever want to talk? You ever feel like sitting down with us? You know how to reach us.
They were not making too big a deal out of it, but it didn't hurt, as Frankie would tell people.
You plant a seed, you never know.
3 days later, the leaders of the Gambino family sat in a fourth-floor Brooklyn courtroom listening as a series of tape recordings were broadcast from two huge speakers. The U.S. attorney hoped to convince Judge I. Leo Glasser that the men should be kept in jail without bail. The December 12 tape, Gotti's angry and reckless complaints to Locascio, was the centerpiece of the government's argument, and now Gravano also learned what his two friends were saying about him behind his back. Gotti's words were loud and indignant, and they filled the courtroom. Gravano was gripping the table. His knuckles were white, and he was looking straight at Gotti. The Don seemed to be studying his cufflinks, and all the time the raging, disembodied voice continued to swell.
It doesn't even bother me if he had 6, 7 companies himself. I'll tell him, let me know when you feel you're going to choke. But you're not doing that. You're creating a fucking army inside an army. You know what I'm saying, Frankie?
A new voice cut in. It was Locaccio's, higher-pitched and begging for approval.
End up creating another faction. That's right. You're saying it mildly.
The Don had the final word.
And you're not going to do that. I'm not going to allow that.
Gotti turned for a moment to look at Sammy Bull and offered a lazy, apologetic shrug. Gravano fixed his dull eyes on his boss, and he let go of the table. Slowly, like a man feeling his way out of a deep sleep, he squeezed his right hand into a fist, then his left hand. He put both fists in front of him and turned away from Gotti to stare across the room. The judge ordered that all 3 men should be detained in the MCC, Metropolitan Correctional Center, until the conclusion of their trial on murder, RICO, loan sharking, gambling, obstruction of justice, and tax evasion charges. They were being led out of the courtroom when Gravano made his move. He was walking ahead of Gotti when he suddenly turned and backed the Don into the wall. Gravano's hands were at his sides, but he was on his toes, stretching to get right in Gotti's face.
How the fuck could you say those things about me? It was just talk, Sammy. Don't mean shit.
The marshal grabbed Gravano's arm and pulled him away.
Yeah, talk. Some fucking talk.
When Gabriel told Mao about Sammy's bracing the Don, Mao had to agree that things were going exactly as he had planned. It wasn't easy time being locked in MCC and knowing that all you had to look forward to was a trial, or that if you were found guilty you were facing life without the possibility of parole. The government would send you to Marion, the federal penitentiary in Illinois, where they shipped all the hard cases. Gravano and Gotti had talked about that after their arrest. It would be 23 hours a day in solitary, and 1 shower a week. And the only way you'd get out was in a box. But after the detention hearing, the 2 men didn't talk much. In fact, the Don sent word to his underboss that he was not to meet with a lawyer unless Gotti was there, which was the same as telling Gravano he didn't trust him. Gravano felt as if he'd been shoved into a corner and there was no way out. He was convinced he knew where the family's strategy was heading. John was going to beat the rap on Castellano, leaving him to take the heat for the murders of Louis Melito, Robert DiBernardo, and Louis De Bono. And all the time he was in the MCC, Gravano kept on making a list of the people he would have to kill if he ever got out. After hearing the December 12 tape, He knew he would have to whack Gotti, the Don's brother Pete, John Jr., and Frankie Locke, too, just to be sure. By the time Gravano finished counting up all the people he would have to kill, he had 12 names on his hit list. Hell of a life that would be. It was the first week in October when, after 10 months in jail, Gravano told his wife Deborah he wanted her to make a call. Debbie Gravano contacted Frankie Sparrow. "I have a message from Sammy. He wants to talk with you, but he doesn't want anyone else to know about it. Can you arrange to meet with him in private?" Mao knew it could be a trap. The family, running out of options, had come up with the perfect plan. Sammy Bull would be their new mole. He would spy on the prosecution for them. He would lead them on, help them shape their case, and then when he took the stand he would suddenly be struck with amnesia. "Gee, I don't remember saying that," he would mumble. Gotti would break out in a big smirk, and the jury would be left to wonder what sort of underhanded scheme the government was now attempting against the Teflon Don. But if it was for real, then it would be the most significant defection in the history of organized crime. If it was for real. Only the twins were sure it wasn't a trick. "We know Sammy," they insisted. "This fits. He spent a lifetime playing all the angles, and now he's playing the only one he's got left." One morning, after giving handwriting examples, Gravano was not led back to the detention cells, as he regularly was, but to a jury room. Waiting inside were Gabriel, the twins, and John Gleason, the assistant U.S. attorney who would be trying the Gotti case for Andy Maloney. When Gravano entered, all conversation in the room stopped. Gravano had prepared a speech, and this was his moment to deliver it.
"I'm concerned a lot about certain things. I'm an important figure. I have a lot to offer. I'm thinking maybe we can make a deal."
Gabriel asked what kind of deal Gravano was looking for.
"If I talk, I walk."
Gleason said that would be impossible. Gravano would have to do time. How much, Gravano asked, and it was noted by the agents he had already stepped away from his initial demand. 20 years, Gleason said. It was the sentence Maloney had told him to offer. Gravano didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. It was at that moment that everyone in the room realized a deal could be negotiated. He led them through a minute-by-minute account of the murder of Paul Castellano. By the time he had finished, everyone in the room wanted to make the deal. He would be required to testify in trials for the next 2 years. He would have to plead guilty to a charge carrying a maximum imprisonment of 20 years, sentencing to be done at the end of 2 years. Mao kept pace with Gravano, walking next to him in the rain to the waiting car. Sammy Bull was on his toes, trying to seem taller.
"You're from Iowa, right?"
"That's right."
"Never met anyone from Iowa before."
Mao wondered where Gravano had heard that. The two men continued walking side by side in the rain toward the car. An agent held the back door open for Gravano.
"I guess if I'm going to trust anybody, might as well be someone from Iowa."
He climbed into the back seat of the car. An hour later, they were in a motel room out on Long Island, and Gravano was ready.
"Where do we begin?"
Mao answered, "Tell me about the cop, Peist." So Gravano did. For his services, Peist earned $500 a week. But whenever he came up with a big piece of news, Gotti sent $10,000 to the cop. When Gravano finished, Mao knew he finally had enough to indict them all. Peist, Mavis, Helbig, and Correo. He had trapped the mole. The stakes were impossibly high. It was as if $75 million, the Justice Department's ballpark estimate of what it had cost to make the Gotti case and bring it to trial, were riding on this one roll of the dice. That was how Mao and his team felt as they waited in the Brooklyn courtroom on Monday, March 2, 1992, for Salvatore Gravano to take the stand and testify against John Gotti. Jim Fox, the head of the New York office of the FBI, asked Gravano if he realized how important his testimony would be. Gravano answered proudly,
"It will be the beginning of the end of organized crime."
An hour later, John Gleason was speaking in the courtroom. Gleason asked his first question, and Gravano, his voice soft and hoarse, answered,
"John was the boss. I was the underboss."
As Gravano continued, Gotti focused on him. The Don's posture was erect, his shoulders back, his head high, and all the while his eyes continued to fix Gravano with a rock-hard stare. But Gravano could not be intimidated. He seemed impenetrable. It was as if he was saying to Gotti, "I can take your best shot." In his soft, almost lazy voice, he told how Gotti had planned and participated in the murder of Paul Castellano. At the end of the first day of steady, unruffled testimony, Gotti had his hands clenched into tight fists as he was led out of the courtroom, and Fox went up to Mao. "We've won." When the summations came, it was almost an anticlimax. Gleason spoke first, his tone grave and deliberate. He was talking to the jurors about the strength of the government's case, but he might just as well have been congratulating Bruce Mao and his men. "I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, when you have this type of criminal committing this type of crime, there are only two ways to prove it. One, catch them talking about their crimes. Figure out a way to find those secret meetings and record them. There's one other way. Get one of them to come in and tell you about the crimes. We did both." The end came on April 2. After deliberating for just a day and a half, the jury returned to the courtroom with their verdict. The clerk, Louise Chalat, read from the verdict sheet. Her voice was loud and precise. "Count 1, RICO, conspiracy to murder Paul Castellano and murder of Paul Castellano. How do you find? Proven or not proven?" "Proven." Gotti's head pulled back as if he had been shot. He stared ahead blankly as the voices droned on. He was found guilty of all 14 counts in the indictment. Frank Locascio succeeded in beating one minor charge of illegal gambling. Other than that, he was convicted on all counts. When Fox heard the news, he got into his car and drove to the Brooklyn courthouse to speak to the press. "The Teflon is gone. The Don is covered with Velcro." Bruce Mao had succeeded in bringing down the most powerful mafia don in the country. Later that afternoon, at Gabriel's persistent urging, he went to the retirement party for Don Story, one of the assistant directors of the New York office. Agents had flown in from all around the country to say goodbye to Story. When Mao walked in, the room fell into silence. Then one agent rose and started applauding. Then another. Then everyone was on his feet applauding Bruce Mao. The noise broke out around him, and he tried to stand stiffly in the center of it all until it passed. But it lasted a while. Later, after a beer or two, he found himself sitting next to his old friend from the Sun Luck Club, Jim Moody. "Well, Bruce, what's next?" Mao took a puff on his pipe and considered the question. The entire case, all he had done over the last 7 years, seemed to race through his mind in an instant. He thought about Willie Boy Johnson, a death that could have been avoided. He thought about sacrifices, the looker, Easter, and how he had demanded so much of them and others. He thought about the endless hours of surveillance, about the ingenuity and bravery of Kravik and his men, and how they had done the impossible, planted a mic in the most secret of the Don's meeting places. He thought about betrayal, Peist's and Gravano's. He thought about a ruthlessness and greed and violence that had become commonplace, of a treachery that had succeeded in bribing juries and a police officer. He thought about the many times when the case had fallen apart, only to be put back together again by the cunning and commitment of his men, and by luck. He thought about victory. Mao spoke at last. "Well, there are still 21 capos." John Gotti was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On June 24, 1992, he was delivered to the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. He is determined to continue to rule his family. Salvatore Gravano has testified in 2 additional trials as a government witness. Most of his days, however, have been spent alone in special federal detention centers known as rat units. He will be formally sentenced in November 1993. His house on Staten Island is empty, and none of the neighbors know where his wife and children have gone, or if they will return. William Peist pled guilty to charges involving the sale of confidential information to John Gotti on February 26, 1993, just 2 days before his trial was to begin. He lost his $24,000 a year police department pension, and he could be sentenced to 20 years in jail. Bruce Mao, was awarded the Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award in a ceremony at the Department of Justice on December 13, 1992. The next day, he returned to his office on Queens Boulevard and to the C-16 squad.
Gangland, The Secret Wars of the FBI's Gambino Squad, The Hunt for John Gotti, was written by Howard Bloom and read by Jerry Orbach. It was abridged for audio by Matt Fenton and directed by Naomi Thornton. The recording engineer was Dave Levan, with post-production by Leszek Wojcik. The associate producer was Christine Nelson. Gangland was produced by Susan Perrin-Totlin.